The world called Thelio 7 had not seen a supply convoy in 14 months. Its people survived on ration cubes stamped with the administratum's eagle, each cube older than the children who chewed them. The sky bore the Great Rift's scar, a gash of boiling violet that rendered the stars meaningless. Vox casters crackled with ghost frequencies, voices from ships that had died years ago, still bouncing through the warp's distortion. Astropaths wept blood when they tried to scream past the static. This was Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy severed from Terra's light by Cicatrix Maledictum. No Astronomicon reached here. No reliable routes existed. Every decision carried the weight of isolation. Every choice made in the certainty that help would not come. In the chapel of St. Candor, the unyielding 300 refugees knelt on stone worn smooth by centuries of penance. They did not pray for salvation. They had learned better. They prayed for permission to endure one more day, for the strength to die with the Emperor's name on their lips, instead of screaming it as a curse. The Chaos Warband arrived at twilight. 12 heretic Astartes in armor that wept rust and wore the flayed faces of imperial saints as trophies. They did not announce themselves with orbital bombardment. That would have been mercy. Instead, they walked through the refugee district, selecting subjects for their ritual with the care of artisans choosing materials. The young, the faithful, the ones who still wept, the ones who believed the Emperor watched. The killing was not frenzied. It was liturgical. They erected symbols in the district square structures built from bone and wire that hurt to perceive. The geometry was wrong angles that bent away from sanity. Around these abominations, they arranged their chosen victims, still alive, still conscious. One heretic, Astartes' armor bearing the 8-pointed star, half corroded by verdigris, began a chant in a language that predated humanity's first words. The crowd in the chapel heard the screaming begin. Mothers clamped hands over their children's mouths. Fathers pressed foreheads to stone hard enough to bruise. The ecclesiarchy priest leading the prayers raised his voice, trying to drown out the sounds with litanies of devotion. His voice cracked. He kept going. What else could he do? Then the sky cracked. Not with thunder, with displacement. The air itself recoiled from something that violated its space. The impact crater measured 30 meters across, glowing with heat that turned falling rain to steam. Rubble sprayed outward. A chaos transport parked in the street crumpled like parchment. From the smoke, a figure rose, humanoid, approximately 2 meters tall, clad in a suit of black and silver that bore no imperial aquila, no mechanicus cogtooth, no mark of any recognized authority. The material reflected light in ways that made the eye slide away, uncertain what it was seeing. The symbol on his chest, a stylized letter in silver, meant nothing to anyone present. The refugees stared. The heretic Astartes turned from their ritual, and Superboy Prime looked at the child being dragged toward the bone wire structure, saw the collar around her throat, the blood running from where it cut into flesh, the absolute certainty in her eyes that no one was coming, that the universe had no mercy left. And something in him, something that remembered a world where heroes arrived in time, where the story bent toward justice, where it was supposed to be different, ignited. He moved. The first heretic Astartes died before his weapon cleared its holster. Prime's fist punched through the ceramite breastplate, through the rib cage, beneath through the spine, and out the back, in a spray of shattered armor and liquefied organs. The body hung on Prime's arm for a moment, twitching before he flung it aside with enough force to embed the corpse in a rockcrete wall 20 meters distant. The others reacted with the speed of transhuman warriors. Bolters rose. Rounds capable of penetrating tank armor filled the air. Prime walked through the barrage. Bolt rounds detonated against his suit, against his skin, and did nothing. He reached the nearest heretic Astartes, the one with the 8-pointed star, and gripped the warrior's helmet with both hands. "No," Prime said. The first word he had spoken in this universe. He twisted. The helmet tore free with the head still inside its cervical vertebrae dangling like broken chain. He dropped it and turned to the next target. What followed was not a battle. Battles implied the possibility of opposition. This was extermination. Prime moved through the warband with methodical efficiency, each motion economical and absolute. He shattered a Chaos Marine's leg with a kick that pulverized femur and knee joint simultaneously, then crushed the warrior's skull under his boot before the body hit the ground. He caught a chainsword mid-swing, ripped it from its wielder's hands, and drove the blade through the warrior's gorget hard enough to sever the head completely. When one heretic Astartes tried to flee, Prime flew. His movement defied the local gravity, a straight-line acceleration that ended with his shoulder impacting the fleeing warrior's spine at supersonic velocity. The body broke in half. The entire engagement lasted 43 seconds. 12 heretic Astartes, 12 corpses. The bone wire structures stood undamaged, but their architects lay scattered in pieces across the district square. Steam rose from cooling armor. The smell of burned propellant and ruptured organs filled the air. Prime stood in the center of the carnage, breathing hard. Not from exertion, from rage that had nowhere left to go. The child with the collar stared at him. She was maybe 7 years old, malnourished, bruised. Her collar was crude iron fastened with a lock that looked like it had been made in a front older than her grandfather. She did not run. She did not speak. She simply looked at this stranger who had appeared from the sky and killed the monsters. Prime knelt. He gripped the collar with one hand and pulled. The iron bent, then snapped. He tossed the pieces aside. "Go home," he said. She ran. The refugees emerged from the chapel slowly, like prey animals testing whether a predator had truly left. They saw the bodies. They saw the stranger in black and silver standing amid carnage that would have required a full Astartes kill team to achieve. They saw the broken ritual structures, the freed victims stumbling away in shock. And they knelt. It started with one man, an elderly laborer, with hands like gnarled wood. He pressed his forehead to the ground and whispered something Prime could not hear. Then a woman joined him. Then a dozen more. Within moments, the entire crowd knelt in the street, foreheads touching stone wet with blood and rain. "The Emperor's angel," someone whispered. "The king in the dark," another voice said louder. "Deliverance," a third voice sobbed. Prime felt his jaw tighten. This was wrong. He was not their angel. He was not anyone's king. He had simply seen something evil and stopped it the way it was supposed to work, the way the story was supposed to go. "Get up," he said. They did not get up. They pressed harder into the stone, some weeping, some praying in broken high Gothic that mixed devotion with desperation. Prime could hear the litanies, could parse the meaning, even though the language was foreign. They were thanking him, promising loyalty, offering service, offering worship. He wanted to tell them to stop, wanted to explain he was not what they thought, that he was just someone trying to fix what was broken, trying to make things right in a universe that seemed determined to be wrong. But he had no words for that. Not in their language, not in any language that would make them understand. So he stood there silent while they knelt and prayed to something he was not. Somewhere in the cathedral district, an astropath screamed. Her choir mates rushed to her as a blood ran from her nose, her ears, her tear ducts. She clawed at the air, trying to shape the psychic signal her mind was receiving into something coherent. Anomaly, she gasped. Unregistered. No warp signature, no Imperial classification, no... She convulsed. Her handler caught her before she could fall. Location, he demanded. Thelio 7, Refugee District. It killed them. It saved them. She gagged on blood. It does not belong. The handler activated his Vox bead, connecting to the nearest functioning relay. The signal would take weeks to reach anyone with authority, maybe months. Imperium Nihilis was a realm where information moved at the speed of desperation. But it would reach them eventually. And when it did, questions would be asked. Assessments would be made. Decisions would follow decisions built on incomplete data and the fundamental assumption that in the dark half of the galaxy, anything powerful enough to save you was powerful enough to damn you twice over. On Thelio 7, in the Refugee District, Superboy Prime stood among the kneeling crowd and felt the first stirrings of something he would not recognize until much later. The trap was not being built by enemies. It was being built by gratitude, by hope, by people so desperate for salvation that they would construct a messiah from whoever happened to arrive in time. And he had no idea how to tell them that messiahs in this universe died screaming or became the very thing they fought against. The rain continued to fall. The great rift pulsed overhead like an infected wound in reality. And in the dark places between stars, things that fed on faith and desperation stirred with interest, sensing the birth of something new. Something that did not fit. Something that could be used. Something that would break beautifully when the time came. Prime looked up at the violet scars splitting the sky and felt for the first time since arriving in this universe something close to purpose. That wound was wrong. It was the reason these people suffered. It was the thing keeping help from arriving, the barrier between them and whatever counted as light in this nightmare galaxy. If he could close it, if he could fix it, if he could rewrite that part of the story. The thought was interrupted by a sound. Not thunder, not warp distortion. Engines, multiple engines, descending from low orbit, Imperial vessels, 3 of them bearing the marks of official authority. Not a rescue convoy, not reinforcements, observers. Prime watched them approach and understood with the clarity that comes from bitter experience that he had just become a problem requiring assessment. The kneeling crowd did not look up. They kept praying, kept thanking him, kept building their prison of faith one word at a time. And Prime, who had wanted so desperately to be the hero who had punched his way through reality itself, seeking a universe where he could be right, stood in the rain and realized he had just volunteered for something far worse than exile. He had volunteered to be needed. The landing craft touched down at the edge of the district ramps, descending with hydraulic precision. Armored figures emerged, their movements methodical and official. They carried data slates scanning equipment, weapons held ready but not aimed. One figure stood apart from the rest. Taller, older, wearing armor painted red and gold, bearing a mask of worked metal that caught the light and transformed a face into something between angel and skull. Commander Dante, Lord Regent of Imperium Nihilis, looked across the square at the stranger in black and silver, at the 12 corpses, at the kneeling masses, and felt the weight of another impossible decision, settling on shoulders already bent by 15 centuries of war. He had come seeking a weapon. He might have found something far more dangerous. A variable. Dante's command vessel hung in low orbit like a cathedral of weaponry and despair. The Blade of Vengeance had seen combat since before the Great Rift tore reality in half, its hull bearing scars from engagements that predated most of the crew by centuries. In the Strategium, hololithic displays projected the tactical situation across Imperium Nihilus in failing light. Entire sectors marked red for lost contact, amber for contested, and the rarest color of all, green, for holding. Thalios 7 flickered amber. It would turn green or red within the week, depending on what the stranger in the refugee district turned out to be. Dante stood before the central display mask, reflecting data streams in gold and crimson. His sanguinary guard flanked him, silent sentinels in burnished auramite. None of them spoke. They had learned over the long years of service to recognize when their commander needed silence to think, rather than counsel to consider. The door to the Strategium opened. Inquisitor Vale Kurosant entered without announcement, her augmetic eye already scanning the room's occupants and cataloging threat assessments. She wore the black coat of the Ordo Hereticus, trimmed in red, and her rosette of office hung at her throat like an execution warrant waiting to be signed. "Commander," she said. Not a greeting, an acknowledgement of presence. "Inquisitor." Dante's voice carried the weight of exhaustion refined over millennia into something harder than ceramite. "Your assessment." Kurosant activated her data slate. The device's screen flickered with picked captures from Thalios 7, the stranger's arrival, the extermination of the Chaos Warband, the kneeling masses. Each image had been analyzed, cross-referenced, measured against every known template in Imperial records. "Negative match on all Imperial classifications," she said. "No gene seed markers, no sanctioned augmentation patterns, no Mechanicus origin codes. The suit's material composition defies spectral analysis. Our equipment registers it as simultaneously solid matter and something our sensors classify as impossible geometry." "Xenos?" asked one of the sanguinary guard. His voice filtered through a death mask, identical to Dante's, save for minor variations in the scrollwork. "Insufficient data." Kurosant's augmetic eye whirred, adjusting focus. However, the combat pattern suggests transhuman capability without corresponding physiological structure. Subject moved at velocities exceeding what even Astarte's combat doctrine considers feasible. Strength output equivalent to a dreadnought housed in a frame massing less than a standard human. Dante studied the holopict of Prime standing amid the wreckage. The stranger's posture read as exhausted fury, shoulders tight, hands still clenched. Not the stance of a warrior savoring victory. The stance of someone who had wanted to do more hurt, more, break more. "He saved them," Dante said quietly. "He created a cult." Kurosant tapped her data slate. A new image appeared: refugees, kneeling foreheads pressed to blood-stained stone. Within 6 hours of the incident, 17 separate prayer groups had formed. They are calling him the King in the Dark, the Emperor's uncrowned angel, the Savior beyond the rift. 3 different ecclesiarchy representatives have requested permission to investigate potential sainthood. Sainthood. The word tasted like ash in Dante's mouth. For someone who appeared from nowhere, killed with unknown methods, and bears no imperial iconography. Precisely why this constitutes a schism risk. Kurosant's tone remained clinical, but her fingers moved to the purge authorization seals on her belt. Small cylinders of brass and wax, each one capable of condemning a world. The Imperium Nihilus operates on faith held together by desperation. Introduce a competing object of veneration, and the entire structure fractures. We cannot afford internal conflict when chaos presses from every border. Dante turned from the display to face her directly. His mask made reading his expression impossible, but his posture shifted a subtle straightening that veterans recognized as the prelude to disagreement. "We also cannot afford to waste assets," he said. Thelio 7 is one world in a subsector of 17. 12 of those worlds have gone silent in the past year. The other 4 are holding by margins so thin that a single chaos incursion would collapse them entirely. If this stranger can do what our picked captures suggest, if he can engage and defeat heretic Astartes without support, then he is precisely the kind of variable that destroys empires. Coruscant interrupted. "Commander, with respect, you are thinking tactically. I am thinking strategically. This anomaly has no command structure, no oaths of loyalty, no binding to the throne. He acts according to unknown motivations. Chaos killed innocents, he stopped chaos. The people worshipped him. A clean narrative. But what happens when his definition of innocent conflicts with imperial necessity? What happens when the threat requires purging a population to prevent corruption?" The strategium fell silent. Both knew the answer. Imperium nihilus ran on brutal calculus, save the many by sacrificing the few, hold the line by abandoning territory, preserve humanity, by occasionally burning it. "You want him eliminated?" Dante said. "I want him assessed." Coruscant's augmetic eye focused on Dante's mask, capturing his reflection for later analysis. "And if assessment determines he poses unacceptable risk, then yes. Elimination. Survival of the species justifies all measures." One of the sanguinary guards shifted slightly, hand moving fractionally closer to his weapon. The gesture was subtle, invisible to anyone not trained in reading Astartes' micro-movements. It spoke of disagreement, of loyalty to Dante's judgment over external authority. Coruscant noticed. She always noticed. I am not your enemy, Commander," she said, voice softening by precisely 1 degree, a calculated de-escalation. "I am trying to prevent you from inheriting a disaster larger than the one you already manage. The regent of Imperium nihilus cannot afford to gamble on unknown variables. You need certainty. I can provide it." Dante studied her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the display, to the image of Prime standing in the rain, while refugees knelt around him. "What do you propose?" Coruscant retrieved a second data slate from her coat. This one bore the seal of the Inquisition in black wax, fresh enough that heat still radiated from the impression. "Controlled deployment," she said. "We provide the anomaly with a target, a genuine threat requiring immediate response. Observe his methods. Test his compliance with imperial doctrine. Monitor his psychological responses to command structure and tactical limitations. You want to use him as a weapon, while simultaneously testing whether he will make a good weapon." Dante's tone carried no judgment, merely observation. "And if he fails the test, then we possess actionable intelligence for containment protocols." Coruscant held out the data slate. "I have already identified an appropriate target. Cult of the Broken Promise operating from the Meridian Belt mining cluster. 12,000 cultists entrenched in a facility with civilian hostages. Chaos corruption confirmed, but conventional assault would require resources we cannot spare and would result in unacceptable collateral damage." Dante took the slate, scanning the tactical briefing. The cult was real enough. Intelligence reports confirmed demonic summoning circles, ritual murders, the standard progression of chaos infection. Neutralizing it would save lives, preserve infrastructure, and send a message to other nascent cults in the sector. It was also a perfect trap. If Prime succeeded with minimal collateral damage, he demonstrated value. If he failed to contain the threat, he demonstrated incompetence. If he killed indiscriminately, he demonstrated instability. And if he refused the mission entirely, he demonstrated non-compliance. Every outcome produced data. Data that would determine whether Prime lived or died. I want observation teams embedded at all approach vectors, Dante said, handing the slate back. Medical support on standby, and Coruscant no purge protocols without my direct authorization. If he saves those hostages, he has earned the right to exist until proven otherwise. Agreed. Coruscant's augmetic eye clicked, recording the condition. I will prepare the briefing. When do you want to make contact? Immediately. Dante gestured to his sanguinary guard. Prepare a Thunderhawk. I will deliver the briefing personally. Coruscant's organic eye widened fractionally, the first genuine surprise Dante had seen her display in 3 years of collaboration. You intend to meet him directly? Commander Tactical Doctrine suggests. Tactical Doctrine assumes the enemy is Chaos, Xenos, or Heretics, Dante said. This is something else. Something that does not fit our templates. And I have learned that the only way to understand something truly alien is to stand close enough to see whether it bleeds the same color as you do. He moved toward the stratagem exit, his guard falling into formation around him. At the threshold, he paused. Prepare your assessment tools, Inquisitor. But remember, tools can break. Variables can surprise you. And sometimes the thing you thought was a threat turns out to be the only reason the line holds for one more day. Coruscant watched him leave her augmetic eye, recording every detail of his departure. When the door sealed, she activated her Vox speed, opening an encrypted channel to her personal staff. Begin psychological profile extrapolation, she said. Subject designation Prime. Cross-reference behavior patterns with known entities exhibiting savior complex, combined with documented violence capacity. Flag any matches to historical schism events or failed Imperial saints. Her data slate chimed. Results populated the screen, 73 historical precedents, each one ending in fire betrayal, or faith twisted into something that wore human faces while serving inhuman ends. She added one more note to Prime's file, a single line in High Gothic that translated to, "Compassion without doctrine is heresy waiting to be named." Then she sealed the file, locked it behind 3 layers of inquisitorial encryption, and began composing the briefing that would determine whether Superboy Prime became the Imperium's newest weapon or its latest cautionary tale. On Thelios 7, in temporary quarters, the local administratum had hastily prepared. Prime sat on a metal cot and stared at the wall. The room was 15 feet square, furnished with a cot, a water ration dispenser, and a single flickering lumen strip that gave everything the pallor of a morgue. Outside, he could hear them. The crowds. Still there. Still waiting. Still praying. He had asked them to leave. They had not left. He had walked away. They had followed. He had flown to the roof of the administratum building to escape them. They had gathered below, chanting his name, or what they thought was his name, a bastardization of sounds that transformed Prime into Primus Imperator. The first emperor. The king beyond kings. He wanted to scream at them that they were wrong, that he was not their savior, that he was just someone who could not stand watching children die, while people with the power to help did nothing. But he had learned over years of being told he did not understand, did not belong, was not the real hero, that screaming changed nothing. Actions mattered. Results mattered. Being right mattered. And he had been right to save them. He would be right again tomorrow and the day after and every day until this broken universe learned that the story could be fixed if someone just had the strength to fix it. A knock at the door. 3 measured strikes against metal. Prime stood. It's open. The door opened. The figure who entered filled the frame, massive, ancient, wearing armor that bore the history of warfare in every scratch and dent. The gold mask caught the weak light and reflected it back as something beautiful and terrible. Commander Dante, Lord Regent of Imperium Nihilus, entered the room and closed the door behind him. "You saved 1,400 lives today," Dante said. No preamble, no introduction. The Chaos Warband would have killed them all as offerings to their patron entities. Instead, they died, and the people survived. Thelios VII will remember this for generations. Prime said nothing. He recognized the tone, the setup before the demand. Dante continued, "I command the defense of this half of the galaxy. Every day I make decisions about which worlds receive reinforcements and which worlds die alone in the dark. I do not have enough ships, enough soldiers, enough hope to save everyone. So I save who I can, and I mourn the rest." He stepped closer. Even with the mask, Prime could feel the weight of his gaze. "I am offering you a choice," Dante said. "Continue as you are independent, unaffiliated, acting on impulse, and watch as the Inquisition classifies you as an existential threat and deploys assets to contain or eliminate you, or accept deployment as an auxiliary asset. Under my authority, help save lives that would otherwise be lost, and earn the right to prove that you are what those people outside believe you to be." Prime met the masked gaze and saw no deception there. Only exhaustion. Only the weight of impossible responsibilities borne for so long that they had become identity. "You want me to be your weapon," Prime said. "I want you to help me save people." Dante's voice carried no inflection, no manipulation, just fact. "There is a cult operating in the Meridian Belt. Chaos, corruption spreading through a mining facility with 12,000 civilian hostages. We lack the resources for conventional assault. You do not. You could end this. Save them. Prove that you are the answer to their prayers instead of another nightmare wearing a hero's face." Prime felt his jaw tighten. The phrasing was perfect, a trap made of compassion, a cage built from the exact things he cared about most. But it was also real. Real people, real danger, real chance to be right. "And after?" he asked. "After we assess." Dante did not lie. "You perform well, you save lives, you demonstrate compatibility with Imperial objectives, you continue. You prove unstable, incompatible, or dangerous, we address the problem." "You mean you kill me?" "I mean I do what I must to preserve humanity's survival." Dante's voice did not waver. "Just as you did today when you killed 12 heretic Astartes without hesitation. We are not so different. We both understand that sometimes the only choice is violence or death." Prime looked at this ancient warrior, this regent of darkness, this creature so worn down by duty that even offering help sounded like threat assessment. And he recognized something he had not expected to find in this nightmare universe. Honesty. "When do we leave?" Prime asked. Dante's mask tilted fractionally, acknowledgement, perhaps respect. 1 hour today," he said. "And Prime." He paused at the door. "Those people outside. They need hope more than they need truth. Let them believe what gives them strength to survive tomorrow. You can decide later whether to be their king or their lesson in disappointment." The door closed. Prime sat back down on the cot and listened to the crowds chanting his name. Somewhere in the dark, Inquisitor Coruscant reviewed observation data and updated Prime's file with a single new assessment. Subject responds to direct appeal to Messiah complex. Exploitable. The trap was not made of chains. It was made of exactly the thing Prime had come seeking. A chance to be the hero. The Meridian Belt mining facility hung in the void, like a malignant growth on reality's skin. 50 kilometers of tunnels carved into an asteroid rich with promethium, deposits its value measured in the millions of lives it could fuel across a dozen worlds. Before the cult arrived, 18,000 workers had called it home. Now only 12,000 remained, and intelligence suggested half of those had already turned. Prime stood in the Thunderhawk's troop bay, watching the facility grow larger through the viewport. Beside him, a squad of Dante's sanguinary guard maintained their vigil in silence. They had not spoken to him during the 3-day transit. They simply watched their death masks reflecting his image back at him in burnished gold. The briefing had been clinical. The cult of the broken promise worshipped something the Inquisition designated as Emergent Warp Entity Category Sigma 7. They believed reality was a lie, waiting to be shattered. That suffering was the hammer, and that enough pain would crack existence open to reveal truth underneath. Their converts underwent ritual scarification. Each cut a word in a language that hurt to perceive. The hostages were workers who had resisted conversion. Locked in hab blocks deep in the facility's core, surrounded by cultists, willing to die, eager to die, if it meant their blood could feed the entity one more meal. Standard protocol called for orbital bombardment. Seal the facility, deploy cyclonic warheads, sterilize the infection before it spread. The Administratum had already written off the 12,000 lives as acceptable loss. Prime had read the briefing and felt his hands curl into fists hard enough to dent the data slate's casing. The Thunderhawk shuddered as it breached the facility's docking bay. Warning klaxons shrieked. The cult knew they were coming. Prime moved toward the assault ramp before it fully descended. "Wait for tactical assessment," one of the sanguinary guards said. Voice processed through his mask's vox grill into something between human and weapon. Prime looked at him, said nothing, walked down the ramp. The docking bay stank of incense and rot. Bodies hung from the ceiling on chains, their torsos carved open to display organs arranged in patterns that made the eye water. Cultists emerged from the shadows, dozens of them, hundreds, their flesh covered in scars that wept luminous fluid. They carried crude weapons, industrial tools, repurposed for murder. They charged. Prime met them in the center of the bay. His first punch caved in a cultist's chest, the rib cage collapsing inward to pulp the heart and lungs simultaneously. He pivoted, caught a wrench swung at his head, and used it to bludgeon 3 more cultists into broken meat. When they tried to swarm him, he simply flexed a shockwave of displaced air that flung bodies into walls hard enough to shatter spines. Behind him, the sanguinary guard descended the ramp in perfect formation, bolters acquiring targets with machine precision. They did not fire. Their orders were observation, not intervention. They watched Prime work with the clinical detachment of scientists observing an experiment. Prime carved through the mob, like a blade through parchment. Every movement was economic brutal absolute. A kick that separated a cultist's head from shoulders. A backhand that turned a jaw into fragments. He did not waste motion, did not grandstand, simply ended threats with the efficiency of something built to solve problems through application of overwhelming force. The bay fell silent. Bodies littered the deck, plating leaking fluids that pooled in the grates. The scars on their flesh had stopped glowing. Prime turned to the sanguinary guard. "Where are the hostages?" The squad leader consulted a tactical display projected from his gauntlet. Hab block 7-3 kilometers through the primary mining shaft. Intelligence suggests the cult will use them as leverage if pressed. Then don't give them time to press. Prime lifted off the deck, flying deeper into the facility, through corridors designed for vehicles, not aerial movement. Behind him, The sanguinary guard activated their jump packs and followed their armor's thrusters, leaving contrails of superheated air. The facility was a labyrinth of madness. Walls carved with symbols that hurt to read. Altars built from broken mining equipment and human remains. In one junction, Prime found a circle of cultists chanting around a pit that pulsed with light the color of diseased tissue. They did not stop chanting when he arrived. They simply looked up, smiled with mouths cut too wide, and continued their ritual. Prime collapsed the ceiling on them. 300 tons of rockcrete and steel brought down with a single strike to the junction's primary support beam. The chanting stopped. The light in the pit guttered and died. He moved on. The sanguinary guard maintained pursuit, logging every kill, every second of travel time, every decision point where Prime chose violence over negotiation. Their helmet recorders captured data that would be analyzed for weeks: threat assessment protocols, collateral damage ratios, psychological stress indicators. Prime knew they were watching. He did not care. The hostages were 3 kilometers away, and every second he wasted was another second they spent locked in darkness, waiting for someone to save them or kill them. He chose to be the one who saved them. Hab Block 7's entrance was barricaded with debris and guarded by cultists wielding autoguns scavenged from the facility's security stations. They opened fire the moment Prime rounded the corner, last bolts and solid slugs filling the corridor with lethal energy. Prime walked through it. The rounds sparked off his suit, off his skin, doing nothing. He reached the barricade and tore it apart, with his hands ripping plasteel and rockcrete away like wet parchment. The cultists behind it died quickly, crushed broken-ended, before they could scream prayers to their warp-born god. The door to the Hab block was sealed with industrial welds. Prime punched through it, the metal shrieking as his fist created a hole large enough to step through. Inside, the hostages huddled in the darkness. 1,200 souls packed into a space designed for half that number. Children, elderly, wounded. Their eyes reflected Prime's silhouette in the doorway, backlit by the corridor's emergency lumens, standing amid carnage covered in the blood of their captors. For a moment, no one moved. Then a child, maybe 9 years old, face hollow from malnutrition, started crying. Not from fear, from relief. "We're getting out," Prime said. His voice was rough, carrying the weight of 3 days watching people kill each other over which version of lies they believed. "Everyone who can walk, walk. Everyone who can't, I'll carry." An elderly woman at the front of the crowd stepped forward. She wore the coveralls of a mining supervisor, the fabric stained with blood and waste. Her hands shook as she reached toward Prime. "The Emperor sent you," she whispered. Prime wanted to tell her no, wanted to explain that no one sent him, that he was here because Dante had offered him a chance to be useful, and because he could not stand the idea of 1,200 people dying while he had the power to prevent it. But the look in her eyes, the desperate, fragile hope, stopped him. "Just move," he said instead. "Stay behind me. Don't stop for anything." They moved. A column of broken, starving refugees, following a stranger through corridors painted with the blood of cultists, who had thought pain was worship and suffering was prayer. Prime led them, and where cultists tried to block their path, he removed the obstruction with methodical violence. The sanguinary guard followed at the column's rear, weapons ready to provide covering fire if needed. It was never needed. Prime handled every threat before it could materialize into danger for his charges. They reached the docking bay 37 minutes after Prime had first entered the facility. The Thunderhawk's bay was too small for 1,200 refugees, but 3 more transport vessels had arrived. Dante's doing logistics coordinated before Prime had even left Thalios 7. Prime watched the refugees board, counting them as they passed. 1,200 went in, 1,200 came out. 0 acceptable losses. The sanguinary guard squad leader approached him, helmet tilted, in what might have been assessment or acknowledgement. Mission parameters satisfied, the warrior said. All hostages recovered. Cult leadership neutralized. Facility rendered non-viable for continued operations. Good, Prime said. He started toward the Thunderhawk. Inquisitor Coruscant has additional instructions. The squad leader continued. Facility to be sanitized. No survivors outside designated evacuees. No witnesses to operational methodology. Compliance requires. Prime stopped, turned. What does that mean, sanitized? The sanguinary guard did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried the weight of someone delivering a verdict already written. The workers who did not resist conversion. The cultists who surrendered when they saw you coming. The station personnel who hid in the outer sections. He paused. They witnessed an unclassified anomaly conducting military operations without Imperial sanction. Inquisitorial protocol demands containment of information vectors. Prime felt something cold settle in his chest. You're going to kill them. We are going to preserve operational security. The squad leader's tone did not change. Your existence is classified. Knowledge of your existence constitutes security breach. Breaches must be sealed. They're civilians. They are variables. Prime looked past the sanguinary guard to where 3 squads of personnel in inquisitorial black were disembarking from one of the transports. They carried flamers, melta charges, equipment designed not for combat, but for purging. How many? Prime asked quietly. Approximately 4,000 individuals scattered throughout the facility's outer sections, the squad leader said. Some converted, some not. Distinction is irrelevant for security purposes. 4,000 people. 4,000 lives that Prime had not saved because he had been focused on the 1,200 in immediate danger. 4,000 witnesses to the fact that someone outside the Imperium's chain of command had the power to kill chaos cultists and protect civilians. 4,000 people about to die so that Prime's existence could remain a secret. He watched the purge teams form up, watched them check their equipment with the calm efficiency of people performing routine maintenance. They were not excited, not angry, not conflicted, just doing their jobs. No, Prime said. The sanguinary guard tilted his helmet. Clarification required. I said no. Prime's voice was flat cold. You're not killing them? The order comes from Inquisitor Coruscant. Compliance is not optional. Prime moved. Not flying, not charging, simply repositioning himself between the purge teams and the facility entrance. His stance was clear. His intention was absolute. Then she can give the order to someone else, Prime said. I'm not letting you murder 4,000 people because they saw me do the right thing. For a long moment, the docking bay was silent, save for the hum of idling engines and the distant prayer chants of refugees being loaded onto transports. The sanguinary guard squad leader activated his Vox beam. Command, this is Observation Team Primus. Subject has refused compliance with sanitation protocols. Requesting guidance. The response came through clearly enough for Prime to hear. Dante's voice processed through Vox encryption, but still recognizable. Stand down. No purge without my direct authorization. The squad leader's helmet tilted fractionally. Acknowledgement. He gestured to the purge teams. They halted, weapons lowering, but not holstering. Inquisitor Coruscant's voice cut across the Vox channel like a scalpel. Commander, this breach constitutes unacceptable security risk. We cannot permit. The refugees are being transported to quarantine facilities, Dante interrupted. Standard inquisitorial decontamination protocols. memory suppression if you deem it necessary, but no mass execution without evidence of corruption beyond witnessing events. Witnessing constitutes evidence. Then half the Imperium would be dead from seeing things they should not have seen. Dante's voice carried an edge now, exhaustion sharpening into something harder. Stand down, Inquisitor. That is an order from the Lord Regent of Imperium Nihilus. Disobey, and we will discuss what constitutes acceptable security risk for your continued operations. Silence. Then, compliance acknowledged. Revised protocols will be implemented. The Vox clicked off. Prime watched the purge teams board their transport and depart. Watched the last of the refugees loaded onto evacuation vessels. Watched the facility recede as the Thunderhawk lifted off, leaving behind a hollowed-out asteroid, full of dead cultists and empty corridors. The sanguinary guard squad leader stood beside him, silent. Finally, Prime spoke. You were going to do it. Kill them all. Without hesitation. Yes. Why? The squad leader turned to face him fully. Behind the death mask, Prime could not read expression. But the voice carried something close to sincerity. Because in Imperium Nihilus, we save who we can and we mourn the rest. And sometimes mourning requires a flamer and the will to pull the trigger. He paused. You saved 1,200 today, prevented the death of 4,000 more. By our standards, that makes you a hero. By Inquisitor Kurosant's standards, that makes you a complication. And by your standards, the sanguinary guard considered this. You are someone who has not yet learned that the choice is rarely between good and evil. It is between terrible and worse. And the luxury of refusing terrible is afforded only to those who have never watched worse devour everything they love. Prime had no answer to that. The Thunderhawk punched through the asteroid belt and into the warp-translated void beyond, carrying a stranger who had wanted to prove he could be a hero and had instead discovered that in this universe, heroism was measured by how many you failed to save. On the Blade of Vengeance, Inquisitor Kurosant updated Prime's file with a new entry. Subject displays non-compliance when operational parameters conflict with personal moral framework. Demonstrates capability to override Imperial authority through threat of force. Assessment high capability. Moderate stability, unacceptable independence. Recommendation continued. Observation with revised containment protocols. Alternative recommendation, termination before subject accumulates sufficient support base to resist sanction. She sealed the file and forwarded it to 3 other Inquisitors operating in adjacent sectors. Insurance in case Dante's gamble failed. In his quarters, Prime sat alone and stared at his hands. Clean now. The blood washed away. But he could still feel it, the weight of every cultist he had killed, every life he had saved, every person he had failed to protect, because he had been focused on the immediate threat instead of the systemic rot. Dante had called it a test. Prime had passed. But passing felt like failure, and he did not know why. Outside his quarters, the refugees from Meridian Belt were being processed through quarantine. Chemical memory suppression would be administered standard protocol for civilian exposure to classified operations. They would remember being saved. They would not remember who saved them. Another cult quietly erased. Another miracle bureaucratically sanitized. Another day in the Imperium Nihilus, where salvation came with terms and conditions, and hope was rationed like ammunition in a siege without end. Prime closed his eyes and tried not to think about the 1,200 faces looking at him like he was their answer to prayers. Because if he was the answer, the question must have been terrible beyond words. The crisis arrived 17 days after Meridian Belt delivered via astropathic scream so violent it killed the choir transmitting it. Helvus Prime, a border world in the Thelios subsector, had gone dark. Not the slow fade of communication failure or the static hiss of warp interference. Complete silence preceded by a final transmission fragment that intelligence classified as catastrophic corruption event, immediate response required. In the strategium of the Blade of Vengeance, Dante studied the tactical projection with the weariness of someone who had seen this scenario play out 1,000 times across 1,000 worlds. Helvus Prime glowed sickly amber on the display, its planetary icon pulsing with threat indicators that updated in real time as sensor data trickled through the warp's distortion. "Population?" he asked. His aide, a sanguinary priest who had served for 3 centuries, consulted the data slate. 47 million registered imperial citizens. Agricultural world primary export is high-yield grains for surrounding systems. Strategic value, moderate. Symbolic value, high. Loss of Helvus Prime would signal chaos breakthrough in the Thelios defensive line. Corruption assessment. Ordo Malleus rates it Category Omega. Demonic incursion confirmed in 17 cities. Ritual sites detected at major population centers. Estimated conversion rate exceeds 60% within affected zones. The priest paused. Recommended response is immediate exterminatus. Cauterize the infection before it spreads to adjacent systems. Dante said nothing. 47 million lives. 47 million people who had prayed to the emperor every day, who had paid their tithes, who had committed no sin except existing on a world the warp had decided to devour. Standard protocol was clear. Execute planetary sanction. Deploy cyclonic torpedoes or virus bombs. Reduce the surface to molten slag or biological paste. Write the loss into the ledger and move on. He had done it before, would do it again. The mathematics of survival in Imperium Nihilus permitted no other calculus. But this time he had a variable. "Where is Prime?" Dante asked. "Barracks section, training chamber 3, the priest replied. "He has been there for 11 hours. No rest, no sustenance. He appears to be testing the limits of the facility's structural integrity." Dante allowed himself a moment of dark amusement. The training chamber was designed to withstand Astartes combat drills, reinforced walls, shock-absorbing floors, automated repair servitors. Prime had turned it into a laboratory for measuring how much force rockcrete could endure before pulverizing into powder. The answer appeared to be less than Prime could generate. "Summon him," Dante said, "and prepare a tactical briefing for immediate deployment." The priest hesitated. "Commander Inquisitor Coruscant has requested consultation before any deployment of the asset. She believes—" "I know what she believes." Dante's tone carried finality. "She believes Prime is a weapon that will eventually fire in the wrong direction. She may be correct, but right now, I need a weapon, and I need it aimed at Helvus Prime before 47 million people become raw material for whatever nightmare is clawing its way through the veil." The priest bowed and departed to execute the order. Dante turned back to the tactical display. The projection showed Helvus Prime cities in cross-section underground shelters, packed with refugees, surface zones controlled by cultists, and between them, a known no-man's land where chaos and desperation ground against each other in mutual annihilation. Conventional assault would take weeks. Weeks they did not have. The longer chaos held the world, the deeper its roots grew, the harder extermination became. Eventually, the infection would reach critical mass. A warp rift would open. Daemons would pour through in numbers that required fleet-level response, and the entire subsector would burn. unless someone could cut the rot out fast enough to prevent metastasis. Someone like Prime. The strategium door opened. Prime entered his black and silver suit marked with dust from pulverized training equipment. He moved with the loose-limbed tension of someone who had been hitting things for 11 hours and still had violence left to burn. "You need me to kill something," Prime said. "Not a question. I need you to save something." Dante activated the planetary projection, expanding it to fill the strategium's central display. Helvus Prime, 47 million people. Chaos, corruption spreading faster than we can contain. The Inquisition wants to execute planetary sanction, sterilize the entire world to prevent the infection from spreading. Prime studied the projection. His jaw tightened. "And you want me to stop them?" "I want you to make the sanction unnecessary." Dante highlighted 17 locations on the projection, major ritual sites, demonic anchor points, corruption nexuses. Intelligence identifies these as critical nodes sustaining the warp breach. Neutralize them, collapse the enemy's operational structure, buy time for evacuation of uncontaminated population zones. Evacuation to where? Prime's voice was flat. "You said Imperium Nihilus doesn't have resources for conventional operations. Where are 47 million refugees going to go?" Dante met his gaze without flinching. "Wherever we can fit them. Processing stations, agricultural stations, hive city under hives. They will survive in conditions barely above starvation, and they will consider it deliverance because the alternative was transformation into screaming meat for entities that wear human faces the way you wear that suit." Silence stretched between them. "How much time?" Prime asked. "Prime. Intelligence estimates 3 days before warp breach becomes self-sustaining. After that, exterminatus becomes mandatory regardless of evacuation status. 3 days to save 47 million people." Prime's hands curled into fists. "That's not a mission. That's a timer on a bomb you're handing me and calling it a choice." "It is exactly that." Dante's voice carried no apology. "Because the choice is yours. Deploy, execute the mission, save who can be saved, or refuse, and watch me give the order to burn a world because we had the power to prevent it and chose not to use it." Prime turned away from the projection, shoulders tight. When he spoke again, his voice was low, controlled, vibrating with the effort of not shouting. "You're not stupid. You know what you're doing. You keep putting me in positions where saying no means people die and saying yes means I do your work while you keep your hands clean." "Sane. My hands have not been clean since the Great Rift opened, and I accepted the title of Regent." Dante stepped closer, closing the distance until they stood within arm's reach. "I carry the weight of decisions that cost millions of lives. I authorize purges sanctions, strategic withdrawals that doom entire populations. I do this because someone must, and the Emperor saw fit to ensure that burden falls on me, rather than someone who might enjoy it." He gestured at the projection. "I am giving you a chance to carry a different burden. The burden of being the reason 47 million people see tomorrow. Yes, it serves my purposes. Yes, it makes you complicit in Imperial operations. Yes, it means you accept that sometimes salvation requires becoming the thing you hate." Prime looked at him. At this ancient warrior who had fought for 15 centuries and still chose to fight for one more day. At the gold mask that hid expressions but could not hide the exhaustion bleeding through every word. "When do I leave?" Prime asked. "Immediately." Dante returned to the tactical display. Inquisitor Kurosant has deployed observation assets to monitor deployment parameters. She will also coordinate evacuation logistics while you neutralize target sites. She'll kill the ones she decides aren't worth saving. She will make calculations designed to maximize survival within available resources. Dante's tone shifted fractionally, acquiring an edge. And Prime, this time, when she makes those calculations, you will not interfere. You will complete your mission. You will let the Inquisition execute theirs. Because if you force me to choose between your moral certainty and the survival of this subsector, I will choose survival. Every time. The threat was clear. The boundary was drawn. Prime nodded once sharply. Understood. He turned to leave. Prime. Dante's voice stopped him at the threshold. For what small comfort it provides, I would prefer a universe where your way worked. Where compassion without compromise could save everyone. But we do not inhabit that universe. We inhabit this one. And in this one, the only choice is terrible or worse. Prime left without responding. Dante watched him go, then activated his Vox bead. Inquisitor Coruscant. The asset deploys to Helvus Prime immediately. Coordinate evacuation protocols. Prioritize population centers with lowest corruption indices. Coruscant's voice came through crisp and clinical. Acknowledged. Recommended sanitation threshold for questionable zones. Standard protocols. Chemical decontamination for exposure cases. Memory suppression for witnesses to anomalous events. Execution for confirmed corruption. And if the asset interferes with execution protocols, Dante closed his eyes behind his mask. Then we will address the problem. But not until after Helvus Prime is secured or sterilized. We need every advantage we have, even advantages that cost us more than they save. Compliance acknowledged. The Vox clicked off. Dante stood alone in the strategium, surrounded by tactical projections that showed a galaxy bleeding from 10,000 wounds, and wondered how many more times he could deploy Prime before the weapon turned in his hand. The Thunderhawk descent was fire and fury punching through atmosphere thick with ash and the psychic screaming of a world dying in real time. Helvus Prime's sky had turned the color of infected tissue clouds, roiling with warp energy that made the pilot's instruments flicker and fail. Prime watched through the viewport as cities burned below, not with conventional fire, with flames that moved against the wind, that cast shadows in directions light should not permit, that left behind glass, scorched with faces frozen in expressions of transcendent agony. The first target site occupied what intelligence designated as Hive Primus Central Manufactorum, a sprawling complex where 40,000 workers had produced agricultural processing equipment. Now it produced screams and the raw materials for demonic manifestation. The Thunderhawk's ramp dropped while still 300 meters above ground. Prime did not wait for descent. He simply stepped off and fell, gravity pulling him down, through smoke and ash until he impacted the manufactorum's roof with force that cratered the reinforced plascrete. The building shuddered, alarms shrieked, and Prime tore through the roof like parchment dropping into the ritual chamber below. Cultists filled the space, thousands of them arranged in concentric circles around an altar built from melted machinery and human remains. They were chanting in unison voices, layered in harmonics that should not emerge from human throats. At the altar's center, something was emerging, not fully manifested yet. Still translucent, still incomplete, but already wrong in ways that made Prime's vision blur. He hit the floor and started killing. The cultists surged toward him like a tide of madness, their eyes reflecting light that came from inside their skulls. Prime met them with methodical brutality. Punches that pulverized torsos, kicks that shattered legs and spines, movements calculated to end threats with minimal wasted energy. They died screaming prayers that curdled the air. They died laughing. They died calling his name like he was the answer to questions they had carved into their own flesh. Prime reached the altar and drove his fist through it. The structure exploded into fragments, and the thing emerging from its center shrieked a sound that existed in dimensions human ears were not designed to perceive. It thrashed, semi-corporeal limbs flailing, then dissolved into smoke that tasted of copper and burned ozone. The ritual collapsed. The warp energy sustaining it bled away into nothing. Prime turned to the surviving cultists, those too far from the altar to reach him, those fleeing toward exits, those frozen in place by the sudden severance of their connection to the entity they had worshipped. He could kill them. Should kill them, probably. They were corrupted, infected, lost to something that wore their minds like stolen clothing. But some of them were screaming in terror now. Not ecstasy, not devotion, terror. They were looking at their own hands like they did not recognize them, at the scars covering their bodies, at the corpses of their fellow cultists, and they were screaming. Prime made a choice. He left them alive. 16 sites in 3 days. Prime hit them all with the same brutal efficiency drop. From orbit, crash through defenses, destroy the ritual anchors, collapse the warp manifestations. Cultists died by the thousands. Daemons barely formed were torn apart before they could stabilize in real space. The planet's corruption index dropped. The warp breach destabilized. Intelligence reports showed evacuation operations successfully extracting millions from uncontaminated zones. It was working. And then Prime saw what Inquisitor Coruscant's definition of uncontaminated zones actually meant. The evacuation site designated Processing Station Tertius was a refugee camp sprawling across 10 square kilometers. 3 million people packed into temporary shelters, awaiting transport to off-world relocation. Prime had flown over it twice during his deployment, had seen the transports loading civilians, had counted it as a victory. On the third day, returning from the final target site, he saw the smoke. Not warp fire. Not demonic corruption. Conventional promethium flames, military grade, the kind used for sanitization. He changed course. The processing station was burning. Not all of it. Specific sections. Entire city blocks of shelters reduced to ash, while inquisitorial personnel in hazard suits stood at the perimeter with flamers and data slates checking names against lists. Prime landed in the center of the operation, hard enough to crack the ground. Inquisitorial soldiers spun toward him, weapons rising. "Stand down," one of them barked. "Authorized sanitation in progress." Prime looked past them to the shelters still burning. To the bodies visible through the flames, men, women, children reduced to carbon and screaming. "What is this?" His voice was quiet, dangerous. A senior inquisitor stepped forward, his coat bearing the seal of the Ordo Hereticus. Not Coruscant, one of her subordinates. He held a data slate like a shield. "Contamination protocols," he said calmly. These refugees showed exposure markers, ritual scarring, psychic resonance, compromised faith. Standard doctrine requires purging to prevent spread of corruption through evacuation populations. They were rescued. Prime's hands curled into fists. "I cleared those zones. They were clean. No zone is clean until processed through decontamination screening." The Inquisitor consulted his slate. "Our protocols identified 700,000 individuals across all processing stations with unacceptable corruption markers. Sanitation is 40% complete." 700,000. Prime felt something inside him. Something that had been bending under pressure for 3 days, for 3 weeks, for every moment since arriving in this nightmare universe, finally break. "You're killing them," he said. "They're not corrupted. They're scared. They're refugees. They are vectors." The Inquisitor's tone did not change. "And vectors must be sterilized before they can contaminate clean populations. This is inquisitorial sanction authorized by." Prime moved. He did not punch the Inquisitor, did not kill him, simply gripped the man's flamer, ripped it from his hands, and crushed the weapon into scrap metal. Then he turned to the rest of the purge team. "Stop!" They did not stop. They raised weapons. Prime raised his voice. "I said stop!" The shockwave of displaced air from his shout knocked half the team off their feet. The rest froze, weapons tracking him, but fingers not yet pulling triggers. The Inquisitor recovered his balance, face pale but voice steady. "This is interference with sanctioned operations. You are committing heresy. I'm stopping a massacre. You are preserving infection vectors that will doom millions more." The Inquisitor activated his Vox bead. "Command, this is Sanitation Team Primus. Subject Prime has interfered with authorized purge protocols, requesting immediate support." Coruscant's voice came through clear and cold. "Prime, stand down. This is not your jurisdiction." "I cleared those zones," Prime's voice rose. "I destroyed the rituals. I killed the cultists. These people are clean. These people show markers of exposure that intelligence deems unacceptable." Coruscant's tone was clinical, explaining facts to a child. "Your mission was combat operations. Mine is ensuring those operations do not spread the very corruption you were deployed to eliminate. Do not interfere." Prime looked at the burning shelters, at the refugees beyond the perimeter, watching their neighbors burn, wondering if they were next. At the inquisitorial soldiers, waiting for orders for permission to either stand down or open fire on the anomaly interfering with their holy work. And he made a choice. No. Silence. Then Coruscant's voice, still calm. "Commander Dante, the asset has refused direct orders and is preventing execution of sanitation protocols. Request authorization for containment measures." Dante's response came after a pause that felt like centuries compressed into seconds. "Prime, pull back. Let the Inquisition complete their work. This is a direct order from the Lord Regent of Imperium Nihilus." Prime closed his eyes, saw the child on Thalios, 7 collar around her throat, certain no one was coming. Saw 1,200 refugees at Meridian Belt looking at him like he was their salvation. Saw the cultists he had left alive at the Manufactorum, the ones screaming in terror at what they had become. Saw 700,000 people about to burn because someone had decided their fear looked too much like corruption. He opened his eyes. "No," he said again. Then he flew toward the burning shelters faster than the inquisitorial soldiers could track and began pulling people from the flames. Behind him, Coruscant updated Prime's file with a single new entry. Subject has demonstrated terminal non-compliance. Recommend immediate termination protocols. Asset has become liability. On the blade of vengeance, Dante stood before the tactical display and watched a weapon he had deployed turn against the hand that wielded it, and prepared to make a choice between Prime's conscience and 47 million lives that still needed saving. The terrible or the worse, just like always. 3 months after Helvus Prime, the subsector now designated Cluster Primus had transformed into something the Imperium did not have a classification for. Not a rebellion, not a schism, not even heresy in the traditional sense. An anomaly. 17 star systems, spanning a volume of space roughly 30 light-years across, all operating outside standard Imperial command structure. Chaos war bands that approached the cluster's borders were annihilated before breaching planetary orbit. Pirate fleets vanished without distress calls. A Drukhari raiding party sent to harvest slaves from the cluster's outermost world was found drifting in the void. 3 days later, their ships intact, their crews dead, cause of death listed as catastrophic blunt force trauma consistent with individual melee engagement. No one was getting in. No one was getting out. And no one inside was asking the Imperium for help anymore. Because they had Prime. On the world designated Secondus 7, once a Forgefane producing mining equipment, now the administrative heart of what locals called the Perfect Zone. The planetary governor's palace had been repurposed. The throne room, where corrupt administrators had once extracted bribes, now served as a tribunal, where Prime heard grievances. He sat in a chair not designed for sitting, his posture rigid, while a line of petitioners stretched through the hall and out into the street beyond. Workers reporting overseers who hoarded rations. Families demanding justice for murders the Arbites had ignored. Children asking why their parents had to die in tithe quotas that served distant masters who never came. Prime listened to each one, made decisions, removed problems. The overseers who hoarded rations were stripped of authority and put to work in the mines they had exploited. The murderers were executed publicly, their bodies left as warnings. The tithe quotas were have-then-halved again, until they represented what the worlds could provide without starving their populations. It was simple. It was clean. It was exactly what Prime had wanted since arriving in this universe, the power to make things right without asking permission from systems designed to fail the people they claimed to protect. And the people loved him for it. In the streets outside the palace, shrines had appeared. Not grand cathedrals, those still belonged to the Emperor. Small altars tucked into corners, decorated with candles and scraps of black fabric meant to evoke Prime's suit. Prayers whispered in the dark, asking the king in shadow for protection, for justice, for deliverance from the casual cruelties that defined life in the Imperium. The ecclesiarchy had tried to suppress the worship. Priests delivered sermons condemning false idols, proclaiming that only the Emperor deserved devotion. The congregations listened politely, then returned to their secret shrines and prayed to the one who actually answered. Prime had ordered the shrines destroyed 3 times. They kept reappearing, multiplying, spreading like wildfire through populations desperate for something to believe in, beyond the promise of suffering redeemed only in death. He did not understand it, did not want it, but he could not stop it. In the palace's strategy chamber, formerly the governor's trophy room, now filled with maps and tactical displays cobbled together from salvaged equipment, Prime reviewed supply reports with the cluster's new logistics coordinator, a former administratum clerk named Helvin who had survived 3 purges and a corruption outbreak through sheer competence. Grain production is up 17%, Helvin said, consulting a slate cracked across one corner. Ore output increased 12%. Manufacturing efficiency improved across all sectors. He paused. Morale indices are problematic. Define problematic, Prime said. The workers are productive, enthusiastic even. But their enthusiasm is directed toward you, not the Emperor. Survey data shows declining participation in mandatory prayer sessions, increased participation in unauthorized gatherings where your name is invoked. Helvin's hands shook slightly as he delivered the assessment. My lord the Ministorum classifies this as incipient heresy. I'm not their lord. Prime's voice was flat. I'm just someone who stopped people from dying and told the ones bleeding them dry to stop. You are someone who possesses the power to enforce that directive. Helvin met his gaze briefly before looking away, unable to hold eye contact with the figure who had become the cluster's de facto sovereign. To populations accustomed to praying for deliverance and receiving only demands for increased tithes that makes you functionally divine. Prime stood and walked to the chamber's viewport. Outside Secundus VII's capital, sprawled beneath a sky no longer choked with industrial smog, one of his first edicts had been environmental regulations that the previous governor had sold exemptions to for decades. The streets were cleaner, the people healthier. Crime had dropped by 60%. By every measurable standard, the cluster was improving. And yet... "How many shrines this week?" he asked. Helvin consulted his slate. 147 reported. Estimated 3 times that number unreported. The ecclesiarchy has requested permission to deploy confession sweeps and execute ringleaders. Denied. My lord, they are concerned. They're concerned I'm replacing the emperor. Prime turned from the viewport. I'm not. I don't want to be worshipped. I want them to stop dying from problems that have solutions. The distinction may be irrelevant, Helvin said quietly. To someone who has prayed to the emperor for 40 years and received only silence, and then prayed to you once and received justice, the theology is secondary to the result. Prime had no answer to that. A chime sounded proximity alert. Helvin checked the display and went pale. Imperial delegation approaching orbital boundary, he said. Transponder codes identify them as inquisitorial. 3 ships. They are requesting permission to land and conduct inspection. Prime felt his jaw tighten. He had not seen Dante or Coruscant since Helvus Prime, since he had pulled 700,000 refugees from fires the Inquisition had lit and dared them to stop him. Intelligence reports suggested the Imperium had classified the cluster as under observation pending resolution, which translated to, "We haven't decided whether to destroy you yet." Apparently decision time had arrived. Grant permission, Prime said, but monitor everything. If they try to purge anyone, I want to know immediately. The delegation landed 2 hours later in the capital's primary spaceport. 3 inquisitors in black coats flanked by squads of Astra Militarum soldiers whose laser guns were held ready but not aimed. They moved through the capital's streets with the careful precision of people expecting ambush. They received flowers instead. Children ran alongside the procession offering blooms scavenged from gardens now allowed to grow without being taxed as non-essential resource allocation. Workers stopped their labors to watch not with fear, but with curiosity. An elderly woman pressed a handwritten prayer into one inquisitor's palm before hurrying away. The lead inquisitor, a woman named Severus, her coat bearing the crimson trim of the Ordo Hereticus, opened the prayer and read it. Emperor, guide them. King, protect them. Both watch over us. She folded the parchment carefully and continued walking. The tribunal chamber had been cleared for the meeting. Prime sat in the same chair where he heard grievances while the 3 inquisitors stood before him in a formation that suggested both judgment and readiness for violence. Severus spoke first. By authority of the holy orders of the Emperor's Inquisition, we have come to assess the nature of operations within Cluster Primus and determine compliance with Imperial doctrine. You mean you've come to decide if I'm heresy or just inconvenient? Prime said. Severus's expression did not change. The distinction is often academic. We have observed this cluster for 3 months, reviewed astropathic reports, analyzed trade manifests and population data. The results are unusual. She activated a data slate projecting statistics into the air between them. Chaos incursions within cluster boundaries, 0. Pirate activity, 0. Civil unrest down 92%. Productivity increased across all metrics. Tithe compliance maintained at reduced but sustainable levels. She paused. Loyalty to the Emperor, questionable. Loyalty to you, absolute. I didn't ask for loyalty, Prime said. You established a power structure independent of imperial authority, eliminated threats with extreme prejudice, and redistributed resources according to your personal judgment of equity. Severus's voice carried no emotion. Whether you intended to create a cult is irrelevant. You created the conditions for one. Now 17 worlds pray to something that is not the Emperor, and the Imperium must decide what to do about that. One of the other Inquisitors stepped forward, a younger man whose coat bore fresh sanctification seals. We have evidence of shrines, prayer groups, theological deviation. Under standard doctrine, this constitutes grounds for exterminatus class sanctions. Prime stood. The movement was not aggressive, but all three Inquisitors tensed hands, moving to weapons. You can try, Prime said quietly. But before you do, understand something. I didn't come here to replace your Emperor. I came here because people were dying from problems that had solutions, and the only people with power to implement those solutions were too busy protecting their authority to actually use it. You are describing heresy, the younger Inquisitor said. I'm describing what I've seen for 3 months. Prime's voice rose. Worlds where children starve while administrators hoard food, where corrupt officials sell exemptions to safety regulations, and workers die in industrial accidents classified as acceptable losses, where the people pray and pray and pray, and the only answer they get is another tithe demand. The Imperium is vast, Severus said. Corruption exists. Inefficiency exists. These are problems addressed through proper channels and authorized reforms. Your proper channels take centuries. People don't have centuries. Then people die. Severus's tone remained clinical. This is the fundamental bargain of imperial citizenship. Individual lives matter less than species survival. Local suffering is acceptable if it preserves the greater whole. You reject this calculus. Therefore, you reject the Imperium's right to govern. I reject the idea that there's no better way. There is no better way that scales to 1,000,000 worlds and 10,000 years of warfare. Severus stepped close enough that Prime could see the scars on her hands. Old burn marks, the kind received from handling sanctification incense. You have created a perfect zone. 17 worlds where justice is swift, corruption is punished, and people thrive under the rule of someone powerful enough to enforce fairness. It is admirable, it is beautiful, and it is unsustainable. Why? Because you are one individual in a galaxy that requires billions of administrators, trillions of soldiers, and a faith that binds them together, despite the certainty of suffering. Your perfect zone works because you personally enforce every decision. What happens when you are not here? When you cannot be everywhere at once, when someone realizes that if one demigod can replace imperial law, perhaps another can replace you. Prime had no answer. Severus continued. The Imperium is not good. It is barely functional. But it is designed to survive anything except fragmentation. And cults, even benevolent cults, fragment. They create competing loyalties. They inspire imitators who lack your power, but possess your certainty. They teach people that imperial authority sabtati is negotiable. She deactivated the data slate. We are not here to destroy your perfect zone. We are here to quarantine it. Cluster Primus will be designated Autonomous Protectorate, permitted to operate outside standard imperial governance on 3 conditions. 1. All tithe obligations to the wider Imperium are maintained at negotiated levels. 2. No expansion beyond current boundaries. 3. No export of your theological deviation to other imperial worlds. You're isolating us, Prime said. We are preventing metastasis. Severus's voice softened fractionally. You wanted to save people. You have saved 17 worlds. Be satisfied with that, or watch us classify this cluster as schism risk and deploy assets you cannot stop. There's nothing you can deploy that I can't stop. Perhaps. Severus tilted her head. But Commander Dante commands the Blood Angels. Inquisitor Coruscant commands Deathwatch kill teams and Ordo Hereticus assets scattered across 50 sectors. And the Imperium commands cyclonic torpedoes, virus bombs, and the willingness to reduce 17 worlds to ash if it prevents 100 worlds from burning later. She held his gaze. You can fight us. You might win. But winning means watching us glass every world in this cluster from orbit, while you try to be everywhere at once, because we will not fight you directly. We will simply kill everyone you are trying to protect and make you choose between revenge and rescue. And we both know which you will choose. The trap was perfect. Not chains, not weapons. Just the simple arithmetic of genocide delivered with bureaucratic precision. Prime sat down heavily. What do you want from me? Compliance with the 3 conditions, and a message delivered to every world in this cluster explaining that you serve the Emperor's will, and that loyalty to you is loyalty to him. Severus produced a prepared statement written in High Gothic. Read this. Make them believe it. Turn the cult into orthodoxy, and we will leave you alone. Prime took the parchment, read it, felt his hands crumple the edges. It was a lie, every word. But it was a lie that would keep 17 worlds alive. And if I refuse? He asked. Then we begin evacuation protocols for Imperial personnel and prepare sanction strikes. Severus's voice carried no bluff. You have 72 hours to comply. The 3 inquisitors departed, leaving a Prime alone in the tribunal chamber with a statement that would save 17 worlds by reducing him to exactly what he had never wanted to be, a tool of the system. In the streets outside the shrines multiplied. Prayer groups gathered whispering the name of the king in shadow, who had given them justice when the Emperor had given them only demands. And Prime stared at the parchment in his hands and tried to figure out how to tell them that the only way to keep them safe was to lie about who he was and what he wanted. Because the truth that he was just someone trying to fix what was broken was too dangerous for the Imperium to permit. Somewhere in the cluster's outer reaches, a small chapel dedicated to the Emperor stood empty. The priest who had tended it for 40 years had left not from lost faith, but from the realization that faith meant nothing if it demanded suffering without end. He walked to a shrine built in the shadow of an abandoned factory, knelt before candles arranged around a crude icon, black fabric shaped into a symbol that resembled Prime's suit emblem, and prayed to something that had answered when the Emperor had not. The cult grew, and Prime, who had wanted so desperately to be the hero, discovered that being the answer to prayers was indistinguishable from being the lie they needed to survive. On the Blade of Vengeance, Dante received Severus's report and updated the strategic assessment for Cluster Primus. Status contained, Risk level moderate. Recommended action observation. Threat assessment for Prime himself, escalating. Not from malice. From compassion weaponized by desperation. Dante closed the report and prepared the next deployment brief. Because Imperium Nihilus was bleeding from 1,000 wounds, and he had just used his only bandage to plug one hole, while 17 others opened. The mathematics never balanced. They just determined who suffered next. The blockade arrived without warning, materializing from warp translation at the edge of Cluster Primus like a noose drawing tight. 18 Imperial vessels, not a rescue fleet, not reinforcements. An interdiction force bearing the combined seals of the Inquisition Adeptus Mechanicus and the Departamento Munitorum. Their positioning was surgical, each ship controlling a critical warp route, each weapon battery calibrated to cover planetary approaches without providing Prime clear targets he could reach before they scattered. On Secundus 7 in the strategy chamber, Helvin watched the tactical display update with growing horror as sensor data revealed the scope of the deployment. "They're cutting us off," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Every trade route, every supply line, everything." Prime stood before the display, hands clenched. 3 weeks had passed since the Inquisition's ultimatum. 3 weeks since he had delivered their prepared statement. Reading words that transformed his rebellion into orthodoxy, his defiance into service. The cluster's populations had accepted it with the desperate relief of people told their salvation was permitted rather than heretical. But the Imperium had not forgotten, had not forgiven. The blockade was not an attack. It was a siege designed to starve without firing a shot. A priority transmission cut through the Vox channels broadcasting across every frequency in the cluster. The voice was unfamiliar, crisp, processed through multiple layers of encryption and sanctification protocols. "Attention Cluster Primus Administrative Authority. This is Fleet Commandant Vex, operating under joint mandate of the Holy Inquisition and Adeptus Mechanicus. All trade, travel, and communication outside cluster boundaries is hereby suspended pending compliance inspection. All vessels attempting to breach blockade will be destroyed. This is not negotiable. Compliance ensures survival." The transmission ended. The blockade held position engines idling weapon batteries, tracking but not firing. Prime activated the chamber's Vox link. "This is Prime. I'm requesting immediate conference with whoever's in command up there." Silence stretched for 10 seconds. 20. Then a new voice, this one clinical and accompanied by static that suggested heavy augmentation. "Subject Prime. This is Magos Ivrain Tesik of Forge World Styges 8, operating as Principal Mechanicus Liaison for this operation. Your request for conference is acknowledged. However, direct communication is deemed unnecessary for compliance protocols." "What compliance?" Prime's voice rose. "Your inquisitors gave me conditions. I met them. I read your statement. I contained the..." He caught himself before saying cult. "I maintained the agreement. Agreements with anomalous entities require verification beyond verbal compliance." Tesik's voice carried the flat effect of someone delivering technical specifications. "Our mandate requires physical analysis of the substrate anomaly designated Subject Prime. Remote scanning indicates violation of 17 fundamental laws governing matter-energy interaction. You constitute scientific impossibility, requiring resolution. You want to dissect me. We seek to understand the mechanism by which you exist. Dissection is one methodology among several. Cooperation would reduce invasiveness of analysis procedures." Prime looked at Helvin, who had gone pale. The logistics coordinator mouthed a single word: trap. "And if I refuse?" Prime asked. Then blockade maintains indefinitely. Tasik's tone did not change. Cluster Primus sustains 17 worlds. Current supply reserves provide approximately 8 months sustainability without external trade. After that, rationing failures cascade into famine. Population decline begins. Your perfect zone becomes mass grave unless you permit the Mechanicus to acquire necessary data. The Vox clicked to a different channel. Inquisitor Coruscant's voice replaced Tasik's mechanical cadence. Subject Prime. Magos Tasik represents scientific interest. I represent security interest. The Mechanicus wishes to study you. I wish to prevent you from becoming the catalyst for schism that tears Imperium Nihilus apart from within. She paused. But our interests align on one point. You are an unknown variable operating outside Imperial control. Variables must be understood or eliminated. Choose understanding or choose slow death for 17 worlds, while you watch helplessly from your throne. Prime felt rage building behind his sternum hot. Familiar, the same fury that had driven him to punch through reality seeking a universe where he was right. But rage would not solve this, could not punch a blockade, could not feed 17 worlds with raw strength. How long do I have? He asked. 72 hours to signal compliance with inspection protocols, Coruscant said. After that, we begin tightening supply restrictions. First food shipments, then medical supplies, then fuel. We will demonstrate mathematically what happens when systems designed for interdependence are severed from the networks that sustain them. The transmission ended. Prime stood motionless, staring at the tactical display, showing 18 ships holding position like vultures waiting for a corpse to stop moving. My lord, Helvin said carefully, if you permit the Mechanicus to analyze you, there is no guarantee they release you afterward, or that the data they acquire does not become weapon deployed against you. I know. And if you refuse, they starve us. 17 worlds, 400 million people. Helvin's voice cracked. We cannot win this. I know that too. Prime turned from the display and walked to the viewport. Outside, Secundus Seventh's capital continued its daily rhythms, workers heading to factories, children playing in streets no longer choked with industrial waste. People living lives incrementally better than before he had arrived. They did not know yet. Did not know the noose was tightening. Did not know their salvation had an expiration date measured in months, unless Prime surrendered himself to people who saw him as specimen rather than person. He thought about Dante's offer back on Thelios 7. Help me save people. It had seemed straightforward then. Save lives, prove value, earn the right to exist. But existence had a price, and the Imperium was here to collect. A proximity alert chimed new contact entering the system. Single vessel smaller than the blockade ships broadcasting inquisitorial transponder codes, but different classification. Not enforcement. Observation. The vessel approached Secundus 7 and requested landing clearance. Prime granted it, wondering what fresh demand this represented. The shuttle that landed bore no factional markings beyond the inquisitorial seal. A single figure descended the ramp, not Coruscant, not Severus, but someone Prime had not seen since Helvus Prime. Commander Dante, Lord Regent of Imperium Nihilus, walked across the landing pad with the slow precision of someone carrying weight that never lightened. His golden mask caught the afternoon sun and reflected it back as something between blessing and warning. Prime met him at the pad's edge. Did you come to watch me surrender or to expedite the process? I came to offer context. Dante's voice carried exhaustion refined into something harder than ceramite. Because you are about to make a decision that will define whether 17 worlds live or die, and you deserve to understand what you are choosing between. He gestured toward the palace. May we speak privately? They walked through corridors now familiar to Prime halls, where he had heard grievances, made judgments, tried to build something better than the casual cruelty he had encountered everywhere in this universe. The irony was not lost on him that Dante, representative of the system Prime had rejected, walked these halls as guest rather than conqueror. In the strategy chamber, Dante stood before the tactical display, showing the blockade's disposition. He studied it with the analytical precision of someone who had fought sieges across 15 centuries. Efficient, he said finally. Minimal resource expenditure, maximum psychological pressure. Whoever designed this understands that you value the lives you protect more than your own autonomy. Coruscant, Prime said. Coruscant coordinates, but this bears the fingerprints of someone who thinks in systems rather than individuals. Dante turned from the display. The Mechanicus does not hate you. The Inquisition does not fear you specifically. They fear what you represent, proof that imperial authority is negotiable if someone possesses sufficient power to negotiate. I didn't ask to be proof of anything. No. You simply acted according to your conscience and expected the universe to accommodate your morality. Dante's tone held no mockery. That makes you either profoundly naive or profoundly dangerous, and the Imperium cannot afford to determine which through patient observation. Prime felt his jaw tighten. So they send you to convince me to submit to vivisection. They sent me to explain why vivisection is preferable to the alternative. Dante moved to the viewport. If you refuse, the blockade holds. Supplies dwindle. In 8 months, famine begins. You will watch populations turn desperate, then violent, then cannibalistic. You will try to maintain order through force, but force cannot create food, cannot manufacture medicine, cannot sustain 17 worlds without infrastructure. Those worlds never developed because they relied on imperial logistics. He paused. And when the first world dies, when you stand amid millions of corpses and realize your defiance killed them, you will break. You will beg the Mechanicus to take you. And by then, they will demand more than cooperation. They will demand servitude. You're saying I should surrender now to prevent worse surrender later. I am saying that the Imperium does not negotiate with equals. It permits useful tools to operate with limited autonomy, or it destroys threats that refuse compliance. You exist in the narrow space between those categories, and every day you remain there. That space narrows. Prime turned to face him directly. What would you do if you were me? Dante was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried something Prime had not heard before: genuine uncertainty. I would recognize that I cannot save everyone, and that attempting to do so only determines who suffers when I fail. He removed his mask, revealing a face carved by millennia into something between human and monument. I have made that calculation 10,000 times. It does not become easier. It does not become right. But it becomes necessary, or nothing survives. Prime looked at this ancient warrior, this regent, who carried responsibility for half a galaxy dying in the dark, and saw something he had not expected. Understanding. Not agreement. Not approval. But recognition that the trap they both stood in was built from the same fundamental problem: too much need, not enough power, and decisions that punish compassion while rewarding brutality. If I go with the Mechanicus, Prime said slowly, what happens to the cluster? Blockade lifts. Trade resumes. Life continues. Dante replaced his mask. Your absence will create administrative challenges, but Helvin is competent. The systems you established will persist for a time, perhaps years, perhaps decades, if the cluster is fortunate. And then entropy, corruption, the gradual return to Imperial standard operating procedure. Dante's voice held no satisfaction in the assessment. Because systems require maintenance, and the only maintenance you provided was yourself. Remove yourself and the system reverts to mean. Prime felt something cold settle in his chest. So everything I did here was temporary. A delay, not a solution. Everything in Imperium Nihilus is temporary, except suffering. Dante moved toward the door. The question is whether you can accept saving 17 worlds for a decade, instead of saving them forever, or whether your need to be the permanent solution will kill them in 8 months. He paused at the threshold. I cannot tell you what to choose, but I can tell you this: the Mechanicus does not want to kill you. They want to understand you. Submit to their analysis. Provide the data they require, and there exists possibility you emerge from the process intact. Refuse, and the certainty is famine followed by your surrender, under conditions far worse than what is offered now. That's not much of a choice. No, Dante agreed. But it is the choice that exists. And in 300 years of fighting for Imperium Nihilus, I have learned that the only choices available are terrible or worse. The skill lies in distinguishing which is which. He departed, leaving Prime alone in the strategy chamber with a tactical display showing 18 ships and 8 months until mass starvation. Prime stood there for an hour running calculations. Could he destroy the blockade? Probably. He could fly fast enough to reach vessels before they scattered strong enough to rip through their hulls. But they would fire as they died, and some of those shots would hit planets, would kill civilians, would turn his victory into massacre. Could he break through and seek supplies elsewhere, maybe? But that meant abandoning the cluster's defense, meant leaving 17 worlds vulnerable while he scavenged resources, hoping nothing attacked in his absence. Could he find another way? Some third option between submission and starvation. He could not see one. The door opened. Helvin entered carrying reports that no longer mattered. He saw Prime's expression and stopped. My lord. Prime looked at him, this clerk who had survived 3 purges through competence alone, who had helped build the cluster's systems because someone finally gave him permission to apply logic instead of corruption. If I leave, Prime said, can you keep this going? Helvin went very still. For a time, assuming the Imperium permits continued autonomous operation, assuming no major chaos incursions, assuming, his voice failed. My lord, without you, the cluster has no leverage, no defense against forces that see us as problem-requiring solution. How long? Optimistically, 5 years before systems degrade to Imperial standard, realistically. 2 years before corruption reasserts and we become identical to the territories you originally liberated. 2 years, 730 days, 17,000 hours of people living better lives before entropy dragged them back down. Prime thought about the child on Thelio 7. The 1,200 refugees at Meridian Belt. The 700,000 he had pulled from inquisitorial fires. Thought about 400 million people in Cluster Primus living in a perfect zone that existed only because he personally enforced every decision and made a choice. Send a message to Magos Tasik, he said. Tell him I'm coming aboard for his analysis. But I want guarantees. Written, sealed. That trade resumes immediately and the blockade lifts the moment I'm in their custody. Helvin's face crumpled. My lord, they will. I know what they'll do. Prime's voice was flat. But if the choice is between me on a Mechanicus examination table and 400 million people starving, that's not actually a choice. He walked to the viewport one last time, looking down at the Capitol, where shrines to the king in shadow multiplied in defiance of imperial doctrine. They would forget him. Given time, given official rewriting of events, given the slow grind of propaganda and necessity. His perfect zone would fade, become legend, become cautionary tale about the dangers of worshipping false idols. And the people he had saved would return to praying to an emperor who demanded everything and answered nothing. But they would be alive to pray. That would have to be enough. On the lead blockade vessel, Magos Tasik received Prime's surrender and updated his analysis protocols. The anomaly would provide unprecedented data. Material impossibility made manifest. Laws of physics that required rewriting. Knowledge was salvation. The Omnisia's will was clear. In her chambers aboard the inquisitorial flagship, Coruscant updated Prime's file for the final time. Subject Prime has demonstrated terminal compliance under sufficient pressure. Threat level reassessed. Contained. Recommend permanent Mechanicus custody with inquisitorial oversight. Asset value. Moderate for research purposes. Political value neutralized. She sealed the file and archived it among thousands of other cases. Threats identified, assessed, and resolved through application of imperial doctrine. Another variable eliminated. Another day in the Imperium preserved. And in the streets of Secundus, 7, a child knelt before a shrine built from black fabric and candles, praying to the king in shadow, who had given justice when the emperor had given only silence. She did not know her king was surrendering himself to people who would tear him apart to understand what made him work. She only knew he had saved them once, and trusted with the faith of someone who had never learned that trust in this universe was just another word for ammunition, in weapons you did not see aimed at your back. Prime walked toward the shuttle that would carry him to the blockade to the Mechanicus, to analysis that might or might not leave him intact. He did not look back at the palace, did not watch the crowds gathering, sensing something wrong. Just walked. One step, another. The same way he had walked through cultists, through chaos, through every obstacle that had tried to prevent him from doing what was right. This time what was right meant surrendering to people who saw him as puzzle, requiring solution, rather than person deserving autonomy. But the 17 worlds would live, for a while. That was the only victory available. He took it. The Mechanicus analysis chamber was a cathedral of brass and suffering located deep within the bowels of the forged ship Omnisia's Inquiry. Prime had been escorted, not dragged, not forced, but escorted with the polite inevitability of gravity through corridors lined with servitors whose organic components still bore recognizable human features, twisted into expressions of eternal service. They had been polite, had offered sedation, had explained the procedures in detail, using terminology that translated suffering into data points and violation into methodology. Prime had refused sedation, had sat in the restraint chair designed for subjects requiring immobilization, had watched as Magos Tasik and 6 subordinate tech priests arranged their instruments with the reverence of clergy preparing sacred rites. For 3 days they had tested him, measured his cellular structure, his energy output, his impossible violation of thermodynamic law. They had taken samples that regenerated faster than their instruments could process, had subjected him to forces that should have pulverized bone into powder, but instead encountered resistance their equations could not explain. Tasik had been fascinated, clinical, gentle even in the mechanical way that precision could be mistaken for compassion. But on the fourth day, Prime felt something change. A subtle shift in the Magos' approach, less observation, more invasive probing. Instruments designed not to measure, but to extract, to separate, to understand by disassembly. This is not analysis anymore. Prime said, voice rough from disuse. Tisig tilted his head, optical implants adjusting focus. Clarification. All analysis requires increasingly invasive procedures when surface examination yields insufficient data. Your substrate resists non-destructive testing. Therefore, destructive testing becomes necessary to achieve comprehensive understanding. You're going to dissect me. We are going to isolate the mechanism that permits your existence. Tasik's mechadendrites moved with surgical precision, arranging blades that hummed with disruption fields. This requires systematic removal of components to determine which elements are essential to functionality and which are extraneous. Standard anatomical procedure, adapted for anomalous substrate. Prime tested the restraints. They held some kind of energy field that flexed under pressure, but did not break. Designed specifically for him, probably. Calibrated using the last 4 days of data. And if I died during this procedure? He asked. Death is a binary state poorly defined for entities that violate mortality parameters. Tasik moved closer, instruments gleaming. However, loss of cohesion would constitute suboptimal outcome. We will attempt to maintain viability throughout analysis sequence. The blade descended toward Prime's chest. He looked at it. At Tasik's expression of detached focus. At the chamber around him filled with instruments of understanding, purchased through suffering. And thought about Cluster Primus. About 17 worlds continuing their daily lives, unaware their king was being systematically taken apart to satisfy curiosity that wore the mask of science. Thought about the people who had knelt and prayed and built shrines to someone who had simply wanted to help. Thought about every time he had been told he did not understand, did not belong, was not the real hero. Every time the universe had told him the story was written wrong and he was too naive, too broken, too dangerous to be allowed to fix it. The blade touched his skin. Prime felt something inside him, not pain, not fear, but something older and angrier finally reach its breaking point. No, he said. The restraint field shattered, not slowly, not with struggle. It simply ceased to contain him, the energy matrix overloaded by the sheer assertion of his refusal to accept constraint. Prime stood. Tasik stepped back, mechadendrites reconfiguring into defensive postures. Subject Prime, your compliance is required for... Prime's hand shot out, gripped the blade descending toward him, and crushed it into scrap. The metal shrieked, molecular bonds failing under pressure they were never designed to withstand. I'm done, Prime said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of 4 days, watching himself be reduced to data. 4 months watching systems grind people into resources. 4 years of being told the only way to be right was to accept being wrong. I came here because you said it was the price of keeping 17 worlds alive. I let you test me, measure me, catalog every way I break your rules. But I'm not letting you cut me apart to understand what makes me work. Tasik's optical implants flickered processing calculations. Refusal to complete analysis constitutes breach of agreement. Blockade protocols will resume. Cluster Primus populations will experience resource deprivation, leading to cascading system failures, resulting in... I know. Prime's hands clenched into fists. I know what happens. I've run the numbers, seen the projections, Watched you people turn suffering into spreadsheets and call it necessity. He moved toward the chamber's exit. Servitors moved to intercept former humans reduced to biological components in security systems. Prime swept them aside without breaking stride, careful not to kill even these hollow remnants of humanity. "But you made a mistake," he continued. "You thought I would accept any price to save them. Any violation, any reduction of myself into component parts you could study and weaponize and deploy against the next problem that doesn't fit your templates." He reached the door. It was sealed blast doors designed to contain catastrophic failures in experimental procedures. Prime punched through it. The metal tore like parchment. Alarms shrieked. Throughout the fetch at the Forge ship, weapon systems activated defensive protocols engaging to contain the anomaly that had just rejected its assigned role as compliant specimen. Prime flew through corridors at speeds that left sonic booms in his wake, breaking through bulkheads, smashing through security checkpoints, heading not toward escape pods or docking bays, but toward the ship's bridge. He had a message to deliver. The bridge of the Omnissiah's inquiry was a fusion of Imperial Gothic architecture and Mechanicus efficiency vaulted ceilings covered in bronze prayer scripts, banks of cogitators attended by servitors whose fingers had been replaced with data interface plugs. At its center, Fleet Commandant Vex stood surrounded by tactical displays showing the entire blockade disposition. The wall behind him exploded inward. Prime emerged from the debris cloud, fury and purpose burning in every line of his posture. "Here's what's going to happen," Prime said, voice cutting through the chaos of alarms and shouting. "You're going to lift this blockade. You're going to restore trade to Cluster Primus, and you're going to leave those 17 worlds alone." Vex did not reach for weapons, did not call for reinforcements. He simply studied Prime with the cold assessment of someone calculating odds. "Or what? You destroy this vessel. The blockade remains. You destroy the entire fleet. The Imperium deploys replacement forces. You cannot win through force subject Prime. You can only delay consequences you lack the power to prevent." "You're right," Prime said. "I can't fix the Imperium. Can't fix the systems that turn people into numbers and suffering into policy. Can't even fix one cluster of 17 worlds permanently, because the rot is built into the foundation, and pulling it out means pulling everything down." He moved closer. Vex's honor guard raised weapons. Prime ignored them. "But I can fix the thing that made all of this possible in the first place." He looked up as if seeing through the hull, through the void, to the distant scar that split the galaxy in half. The Great Rift. Cicatrix maledictum. The wound that cut off Imperium nihilus from Terra. The reason you don't have resources, don't have hope, don't have anything except desperate mathematics and the certainty that tomorrow will be worse than today. Understanding dawned in Vex's expression. First confusion, then horror. "You cannot be suggesting—" "I'm going to close it," Prime said. "Going to erase it. Going to punch reality until the story rewrites itself and that scar never existed." "That is impossible." Tessik's voice came through the Vox system transmitted from the analysis chamber. "The Great Rift is fundamental warp phenomenon. Chaos-sustained rupture in reality across thousands of light years. No physical force can—" "You keep using that word. Impossible." Prime turned toward the bridge's viewport, toward the distant violet glow, visible even across stellar distances, the light of the warp bleeding through into real space. "Everything about me is impossible by your definitions. I move faster than your physics permits, hit harder than your mathematics allows, exist in ways your laws say I shouldn't." He looked back at Vex. "So maybe your laws are what's broken. Maybe reality isn't as fixed as you think. Maybe someone just needs to be strong enough to tell it no. You will kill yourself, Vex said flatly. Even assuming you reach the rift's edge, attempting to interact with raw warp phenomenon of that magnitude will tear you apart. You are durable, but you are not immune to the Imperium's influence. Probably. Prime moved toward the bridge exit, moving fast enough that by the time guards raised weapons, he was already past them. But if there's a chance, any chance that I can close that wound, can cut off Chaos's highway into this half of the galaxy, can make it so Imperium Nihilus isn't slowly bleeding to death in the dark, then that's better than surrendering to you people cutting me apart for data you'll use to build more efficient ways to process suffering. He paused at the threshold. Tell Dante I tried his way. Tried playing by Imperial rules. Tried accepting that terrible was better than worse. His voice hardened. But the only thing that approach taught me is that you people have surrendered to the idea that nothing can be fixed, so you've built entire systems around managing decline instead of preventing it. That is the reality of our situation, Vex said. Then I'm going to change reality. Prime launched himself through the hull, the metal shrieking as his passage created an exit wound in the ship's superstructure. Emergency bulkheads sealed behind him, containing atmosphere breach. He emerged into void, oriented himself toward the distant purple glow, and accelerated. Behind him, Vex activated fleet-wide Vox. All vessels subject Prime has breached containment and is proceeding toward Cicatrix Maledictum. Recommend immediate withdrawal to safe distance and observation posture. Do not attempt interdiction. Repeat, do not engage. On the blade of vengeance, Dante received the alert and felt something close to dread settle in his chest. He activated priority channels to inquisitorial command. Kurosant. Prime is heading for the Great Rift. Your assessment? Her response came after a pause that suggested calculations running behind the words. If he attempts direct interaction with the rift, probability of survival approaches 0. However, probability of catastrophic secondary effects approaches unity. The rift is not a physical phenomenon we can contain. It is warp manifestation sustained by the largest chaos ritual in recorded history. Disrupting it will have consequences we cannot predict. Meaning we should evacuate every world within 100 light-years of the rift's edge and pray to the Emperor that whatever Prime does kills only him and not half the Imperium with him. Dante looked at the tactical display showing Prime's trajectory, a straight line toward the galaxy's open wound, moving at velocities that made pursuit meaningless. Prepare evacuation protocols, he said quietly. And send word to Gilliman. Whatever happens next, the Lord Commander needs to know that someone just tried to solve Imperium Nihilus's fundamental problem through application of impossible force. Should we attempt to stop him? Dante thought about that. About Prime's rage at being treated as tool rather than person. About 4 months of watching a weapon gradually realize it had been deployed against targets designed to make it break. No, he said finally. Let him try. If he succeeds, we win. If he fails, the problem resolves itself. Either way, the Imperium gets an answer to the question of whether anomalies can be permitted to exist outside doctrine. He did not add that he hoped Prime succeeded. That part of him, the part that still remembered why he had accepted the burden of regent, wanted to see if compassion weaponized could achieve what 15 centuries of brutal pragmatism had not. But hope was a luxury commanders could not afford. He filed the thought away and prepared to document another disaster. Prime flew through the void, alone in the dark, between stars heading toward the thing that had broken half a galaxy, and wondering if being right was enough when the universe had spent 4 months teaching him that being right just meant choosing which people to fail. The great rift grew larger, filling his vision with impossible colors, purples that should not exist, blues that hurt to perceive, colors that existed only in the spectrum of madness given form. He did not slow down, did not doubt, did not let himself think about what would happen to Cluster Primus if this killed him, or what would happen to the galaxy if it worked. Just flew faster, building velocity, gathering force for the only thing he knew how to do when reality told him no. He would hit it until it said yes. The rift's edge was a wall of screaming, not metaphor. Actual screams rendered into pressure waves that existed half in real space and half in dimension since humanity was not designed to perceive. Faces formed in the energy patterns, demons, half-manifest entities, echoes of chaos that had bled through during the rift's formation. They saw him coming. They laughed. Prime drew back his fist and thought for just a moment about the child on Thelios 7. About 1,200 refugees who had looked at him like salvation. About 17 worlds that had built shrines to someone who just wanted them to stop dying. About a universe that had told him over and over that wanting was not enough. Time to prove the universe wrong. He punched. Not at the rift, into it. Through the boundary between real and unreal. His fist connected with something that had no physical substance but responded to impact anyway. Not because physics permitted it, but because Prime's existence was fundamentally incompatible with being told what was possible. The punch carried every ounce of force he could generate. Carried 4 months of rage at system designed to process suffering. Carried 4 years of being told he did not belong. Carried the weight of every person he had tried to save and every system that had punished him for trying. It carried intention. The intention to erase, to deny, to look at reality and declare it unacceptable. The great rift shuddered. For a moment, just a moment, the screaming stopped. The violet light flickered. The wound in reality that had severed Imperium Nihilus from Terra trembled like it was reconsidering its existence. Then it pushed back. Warp energy flooded through the impact point, raw chaos given form and focus. It wrapped around Prime like hands made of madness trying to pull him through, to dissolve him into the immaterium where matter had no meaning and thought was substance. Prime felt his skin burn, felt his mind beginning to fray at the edges where the warp touched thought, felt reality itself rejecting his presence, trying to eject him from existence like a body fighting infection. He did not let go, did not pull back, punched harder. The second impact sent ripples through the rift, visible distortions that propagated outward at faster-than-light velocities, disrupting warp currents that had flowed undisturbed for decades. Navigation routes that had been death traps suddenly cleared. Passages that had been stable inverted into maelstroms. Throughout Imperium, Nihilus astropaths screamed, not in pain, in confusion. The warp was changing, shifting, responding to something that should not be possible. On 1,000 worlds, demons felt their connection to the Imperium waver. Chaos cults found their rituals failing mid-invocation, their sacrifices producing nothing but corpses instead of summonings. And in the warp itself, entities that had been feeding on the Great Rift's energy felt their feast interrupted. One of them, a demon prince wreathed in colors that defied description, wearing the mantle of Tsinch's favor, like a crown turned its attention toward the source of disruption. Kajirix the Unwritten saw Prime hanging at the rift's edge, fist buried in unreality, trying to write the galaxy's greatest wound out of existence through sheer refusal to accept impossibility. and laughed. Not mockery. Recognition. You rewrite reality. Kazurix's voice echoed across dimensions, reaching Prime even through the warp's screaming. How delightfully mortal. How perfectly doomed. The demon manifested at the rift's edge, not fully, not in stable form, but enough to be present, enough to act. You think you can erase this? Kazurix gestured at the rift, with limbs that existed in too many dimensions simultaneously. This wound is sustained by the greatest powers in existence. It is fed by suffering measured in worlds. It is Tzeentch's masterwork, Horn's highway, Nurgle's garden gate, Slaanesch's gateway to excess unbound. The demon moved closer. But please, continue. Punch harder. Bleed yourself trying to rewrite what gods have written. Every drop of your certainty, every ounce of your rage, it feeds the very thing you try to destroy. Prime felt the truth of those words, could feel the warp responding to his determination. His refusal to surrender his absolute certainty that he was right, all of it becoming fuel for the chaos that thrived on extreme emotion. The trap was perfect. Fighting made it worse. Surrendering meant failure. There was no third option. Unless. Prime looked at Kazurix, at the demon that wore change as identity and saw reality as mutable draft. You're right, Prime said. I can't erase it by force alone. He pulled his fist back. The warp surged into the gap, trying to reclaim the space he had disrupted. But I don't need to erase it completely. Just need to make it different. Just need to change the story enough that it stops being your highway and starts being... He punched again. But this time the intention was different. Not erasure, alteration. Not delete the wound, but rewrite what the wound meant. The impact carried a question instead of a demand. What if this scar healed wrong? Reality rippled. The great rift did not close, did not seal, but it changed. Warp routes that had been stable for decades suddenly led nowhere. Entry points the demons had used for reliable manifestation inverted, becoming traps that pulled chaos entities into dead-end dimensions where they dissolved without anchor points. The wound remained, but its function shifted, becoming unstable, unreliable, dangerous even to the things that had created it. Kazurix's laughter cut off. The demon stared at Prime with something approaching respect mixed with fury. You did not close it, the demon said slowly. You broke it differently, made it sick, made it turn on us. Made it not your problem to solve anymore, Prime said. Blood ran from his nose, his ears the price of rewriting reality even slightly. Made it something that hurts you as much as it hurts the Imperium. He pulled back, disengaging from the rift before it could finish dragging him through. His body was burning, damaged by exposure to raw chaos that should have dissolved him completely. But he was still intact, still alive. And behind him, the great rift flickered with new instability, not healed, not closed, but wounded in ways that would take chaos centuries to compensate for. Kazurix watched him retreat and spoke one final sentence voice, carrying across the void with crystal clarity. You have not saved them, little rewriter. You have only changed how they suffer. But I suppose that is victory enough for mortals who mistake survival for triumph. The demon dissolved, returning to the Imperium to report this new complication to powers that would not be pleased. Prime hung in the void, bleeding from wounds that existed in dimensions beyond the physical, and felt his consciousness beginning to fade. He had tried to fix the galaxy's wound, had managed only to make it hurt differently. But differently was something, was better than accepting that nothing could change. He let himself drift, trusting that someone would find him eventually, either to save him or to finish what the warp had started. At this point, he was too tired to care which. They found Prime drifting 3 days later, his body still radiating heat from warp exposure burns that carved patterns across his skin like prophecy written in scar tissue. The recovery team was sanguinary guard Dante had insisted on sending his own, rather than inquisitorial assets, perhaps recognizing that what they retrieved deserved dignity rather than immediate vivisection. He was alive. Barely. His breathing was shallow, irregular cycling between patterns that suggested his biology was attempting to repair damage it had no framework to understand. The burns glowed faintly in spectrums. Human eyes were not designed to perceive residual warp energy, bleeding off in waves that made scanning equipment flicker and fail. They brought him to the Blade of Vengeance medical bay, where sanguinary priests worked in shifts to stabilize something that defied every medical protocol in their considerable experience. They treated the burns with unguents blessed by chaplains, hoping faith could accomplish what science could not. They monitored vitals that fluctuated between superhuman and flatline, without apparent pattern. And they waited. Dante visited once per day, standing at the bedside of someone who had tried to save half a galaxy through application of impossible force. He said nothing, simply stood masked, reflecting the medical bay's sterile light before departing to manage crises that multiplied faster than he could contain them. On the 5th day, Prime's eyes opened. The medical bay was empty except for a single sanguinary priest monitoring instruments. The warrior looked up, saw consciousness return, and activated his Vox speed. "My lord, Subject Prime is awake." Dante arrived within minutes, moving with urgency that belied his usual careful precision. He stood at the bedside mask, angled down at Prime's battered form. "Can you speak?" Dante asked. Prime's throat was dry, damaged. When words came, they emerged as gravel given voice. "Did it work?" "That," Dante said slowly, "depends on your definition of success." He activated a hololithic display mounted on the medical bay wall. The projection showed the Great Rift, or what remained of it. The massive scar still split the galaxy, still separated Imperium Nihilus from Terra. But its edges were unstable now, fluctuating between severity levels. Warp routes that had been reliable death traps now cleared intermittently. Navigation that had been impossible for decades suddenly showed windows of opportunity measured in hours rather than never. "The rift has not closed," Dante said. "But you have wounded it, made it unreliable. Chaos forces that used it as a highway now find their transit routes collapsing mid-journey. Demon incursions that relied on stable manifestation points now struggle to maintain coherence." He paused, adjusting the display to show casualty reports. "In the 72 hours since your impact, chaos activity across Imperium Nihilus has decreased by 43%. Not eliminated, not defeated, but disrupted enough that we are no longer hemorrhaging worlds at the rate we were." Another pause. "You did not fix the rift, but you broke it differently. And in Imperium Nihilus, breaking our enemy's tools is the closest we come to victory." Prime tried to sit up. Pain lanced through every nerve. He fell back, breathing hard. "Cluster Primus," he managed. 17 worlds. Did the blockade, lifted 6 hours after your engagement with the rift." Dante's voice carried something that might have been satisfaction. The Mechanicus deemed continued interdiction unjustifiable given strategic developments. Magos Tesik filed a complaint about interrupted research. But Inquisitor Kurosant overruled on grounds that your action demonstrated value exceeding analysis potential. Prime almost laughed. It hurt too much. "So I'm useful again." You demonstrated that impossible force applied to impossible problems can produce measurable results. Dante deactivated the display. The Imperium does not love you, does not trust you, but it has been forced to acknowledge that you represent capability no other asset provides. And when I'm not useful anymore, then we will revisit the question of what to do with anomalies that refuse classification. Dante moved toward the door. But that day is not today. Today, you have earned the right to exist without immediate threat of sanction. I suggest you use that time wisely. He paused at the threshold. The people of Cluster Primus have been asking about you. 17 worlds that want to know if their king survived his attempt to heal the galaxy's wound. I'm not their king. No. But you are the reason they are alive, and in Imperium Nihilis that is close enough. Dante's mask turned fractionally. I am sending you back to Cluster Primus, not as exile, as recognition that some problems are solved better by those willing to reject doctrine in favor of direct action. Prime felt something tighten in his chest. You're letting me keep the cluster. I am acknowledging that your methods, while incompatible with standard imperial governance, produce outcomes that serve humanity's survival. The 17 worlds under your administration show better compliance, better productivity, and better resistance to chaos corruption than most territories in Nihilis. Dante's voice hardened. But understand this, you exist on sufferance. The moment your perfect zone becomes schism vector, the moment your cult metastasizes beyond containable boundaries, I will authorize exterminatus for all 17 worlds and ensure you watch before you die. Understood. Dante departed, leaving Prime alone with burns that would take weeks to heal, and the knowledge that he had achieved exactly what the Imperium permitted: limited autonomy purchased through demonstration of value measured in enemy casualties and strategic disruption. He had wanted to be a hero, had wanted to fix what was broken, save everyone, make the universe bend toward justice. He had managed to save 17 worlds and wound the galaxy's greatest scar enough that it hurt chaos slightly more than it hurt humanity. It was not the victory he had imagined, but it was the victory available. In the Strategium, Inquisitor Coruscant reviewed final assessments with her staff. Prime's file had been updated, recategorized from threat requiring elimination to asset requiring containment with measured autonomy. Recommended oversight protocols, her aide asked. Quarterly inspections, astropathic monitoring of cluster communications, embedded inquisitorial observers disguised as administratum personnel. Coruscant's augmetic eye clicked recording details. And contingency exterminatus authorization maintained in active status. Subject Prime has demonstrated capacity to disrupt fundamental warp phenomena. That capability must be preserved as strategic asset, but never permitted to exist without kill switch. What if he refuses inspections? Then we demonstrate that autonomy is privilege, not right, and privileges can be revoked. Coruscant closed the file. He saved 17 worlds. We will allow him to continue doing so until the cost of that salvation exceeds its value. Her aide hesitated. Inquisitor, some analysts suggest his impact on the Great Rift may have long-term benefits exceeding initial projections. Navigation improvements could restore supply routes that have been lost for... I am aware. Coruscant's voice was cold. But benefits do not erase the fundamental problem. Subject Prime demonstrated that sufficient power applied without doctrine can alter reality. Every imperial citizen who learns of this learns that authority is negotiable if one simply possesses enough force. That lesson is more dangerous than any demon. She activated her Vox bead opening encrypted channels to inquisitorial cells across 3 sectors. All stations monitor for ideological contagion related to Subject Prime. Any populations demonstrating belief that individual action can supersede imperial hierarchy are to be flagged for correction protocols. We will permit Prime his 17 worlds, but we will not permit his example to spread. The orders went out. Across Imperium, Nihilus Inquisitors began preparing contingencies for the day when Prime's usefulness ended and his existence became liability requiring termination. On Cluster Primus, in the capital of Secundus, 7 Helven received word that Prime was returning. The logistics coordinator stood in the empty tribunal chamber and felt relief war with dread. Relief that their defender had survived. Dread at what survival had cost. He activated cluster-wide Vox broadcasting to all 17 worlds. Citizens of Cluster Primus, I bring news from the Regent of Imperium Nihilus. Our Lord Prime has engaged the Great Rift in combat and survived. He returns to us wounded but unbroken. The blockade has lifted. Trade resumes immediately. Our autonomy continues. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. In his absence, we have maintained the systems he established. Justice without corruption. Labor without exploitation. Faith without false promises. These things will continue. These things are our tribute to the one who showed us that suffering is not inevitable, merely the price we paid for accepting that nothing could change. Throughout the cluster populations received the message with reactions that ranged from jubilation to quiet relief. Shrines to the King in Shadow grew more elaborate, decorated with fragments of black fabric and crude icons, meant to represent the one who had fought reality itself to protect them. The ecclesiarchy priests watched this devotional drift with growing concern, but they said nothing. They had learned over 3 months that in Cluster Primus, the choice was between tolerating heterodox worship and facing populations that would choose their king over the emperor if forced to select one. In the palace in the chamber that had become Prime's de facto throne room, workers prepared for his return. They cleaned floors, polished fixtures, arranged reports documenting everything that had transpired during his absence, production statistics, justice tribunal records, defensive preparations against threats that had not materialized because enemies had learned that Cluster Primus was defended by something that did not accept the word impossible. They worked in silence, each person carrying the knowledge that their salvation had nearly killed itself, trying to save more than 17 worlds. And wondering privately if being saved by someone who refused to accept limits was better or worse than dying under systems that had accepted limitation as eternal. 2 weeks later, Prime returned to Secundus 7 aboard a Thunderhawk that bore no imperial iconography beyond the minimal necessary for identification. He descended the ramp slowly, body still healing from damage that existed in dimensions beyond the physical. The crowd that had gathered at the landing pad did not cheer, did not celebrate. They simply knelt, foreheads pressed to stone in the gesture they had adopted 3 months ago, when a stranger had killed their monsters and asked nothing in return. Prime wanted to tell them to stand, wanted to explain he was not their king, not their savior, just someone who had tried to fix something and managed only to break it differently. But he had learned over 4 months in Imperium Nihilus that the truth was often less useful than the lie people needed to survive. So he walked past them in silence, accepting their devotion, because rejecting it would only hurt them, and made his way to the palace, where Helven waited with reports that documented every way 17 worlds had continued functioning without the one who made them possible. In the tribunal chamber, Prime sat in the chair that had become his throne, whether he wanted it or not, and listened to Helven's accounting. Production maintained. Justice tribunals operated according to established protocols. 0 chaos incursions. 3 pirate probes, all repelled by defense forces using tactics you established. Helvin paused. My lord, in your absence, we proved that the systems you created can function independently. The cluster does not require your constant presence to survive. Just my occasional presence to prevent the Imperium from deciding survival is less important than compliance, Prime said quietly. Helvin's expression flickered. Yes, that summary is accurate. Prime looked at the reports at the evidence that he had built something that could persist without him. It should have felt like victory, should have validated every choice he had made. Instead, it felt like being proven unnecessary for everything, except the violence that kept bigger predators away. What about the shrines? He asked. The prayers? The cult that Inquisitor Kurosant is waiting for an excuse to purge. Growing. Helvin's voice was carefully neutral. Ecclesiarchy estimates 30% of the cluster's population now engages in devotional practices that reference you alongside the Emperor. Another 40% participates irregularly. The remaining 30% maintain Orthodox faith, but do not actively suppress heterodox practices. So, 2/3 of the cluster worships me, and the Inquisition is documenting every instance for future use as evidence when they decide I'm more trouble than I'm worth. That is our assessment, yes. Prime walked to the viewport, looked out at the capital, where people lived incrementally better lives, because he had arrived and refused to accept that their suffering was necessary. How long? He asked. My lord. How long before the Inquisition decides the cluster is schism risk, before they deploy cyclonic torpedoes and make me choose between fighting them and watching 17 worlds burn? Helvin consulted his data slate, though they both knew the answer was not written in any file. Optimistically 5 years. If we manage cult growth carefully and maintain absolute compliance with tithe obligations. He paused. Realistically, 2 years before some incident provides justification for sanction protocols. 2 years. 730 days. The same timeline Helvin had given for how long the cluster's systems would persist without Prime's enforcement. It was all temporary, all borrowed time, all victory measured in delays rather than solutions. Prime thought about Kazirix's final words. You have only changed how they suffer. The demon had been right. Prime had not saved the galaxy, had not closed the rift, had not fixed the systems that ground populations into resources, had only purchased a small reprieve for a tiny fraction of humanity. And even that reprieve came with countdown timer attached. But 730 days meant children who would grow up without starving, meant workers who would labor without being exploited, meant people who would live in conditions marginally less horrific than what the Imperium considered acceptable standard. It was not the happy ending he had wanted. It was barely even an ending, more like intermission between acts of tragedy. But it was something. Draft a message to all 17 worlds. Prime said. Tell them their king has returned. Tell them the systems we built together will continue. Tell them that as long as I have strength, no one will hurt them without going through me first. And the cult, the shrines. Prime closed his eyes. Tell the Ecclesiarchy we will cooperate with reasonable oversight. Tell them the prayers reference me as servant of the Emperor, not replacement. Tell them whatever lie keeps the Inquisition from deploying exterminatus for another 2 years. And after 2 years, we'll see if I can punch reality again and buy us another delay. Prime's voice was flat, exhausted. Because that's all we have. Delays, reprieves, Borrowed time purchased through violence and lies, and accepting that the only choice is terrible or worse. He turned from the viewport. But terrible is still better than worse. And if buying 2 more years of terrible means 17 worlds don't experience worse, then that's the victory available. Helvin bowed and departed to draft the message. Prime stood alone in the tribunal chamber and felt the weight of 17 worlds settling on shoulders that had wanted to carry galaxies. It was not enough. Would never be enough. But it was what he could hold. And in Imperium Nihilus, that would have to suffice. Far above in the warp-twisted void between stars, the great rift pulsed with new instability. Chaos forces attempting to use it for reliable transit found their roots collapsing their summoning circles, failing their carefully constructed invasion plans, disrupted by unpredictability that had not existed before Prime's intervention. It was not defeat. Was not even significant setback. But it was friction. Delay. Cost added to operations that had run smoothly for decades. And in Sarder measured in millennia, where victory was defined as survival, rather than triumph, friction was the only weapon that mattered. The galaxy continued its slow death. The Imperium continued grinding populations into resources. Chaos continued pressing from every border. But in one small cluster of 17 worlds, 400 million people lived under the rule of someone who had refused to accept that suffering was inevitable. They did not know their salvation was temporary. Did not know the countdown had already started. They only knew that for today, they were safe. Tomorrow could be worse. Probably would be worse. But today they had enough food, enough justice, enough hope to believe that maybe the universe was not entirely designed to destroy them. That was not the miracle Prime had wanted to give them. But miracles in Imperium Nihilus were rationed like ammunition. And he had given them all he could carry. In the Strategium of the Blade of Vengeance, Dante updated the strategic assessment for Cluster Primus one final time. Status Autonomous Protectorate, limited oversight. Threat level contained but monitored. Asset value, moderate defensive capability, high symbolic significance. Recommended action, observe and maintain current protocols until situation requires revision. He sealed the file and moved on to the next crisis, the next impossible decision, the next choice between terrible and worse, that defined every waking moment of commanding half a galaxy dying in the dark. But before he closed Cluster Primus from his thoughts entirely, he allowed himself one moment, just one, to acknowledge that sometimes, rarely, the terrible choice produced outcomes that almost resembled hope. It would not last. Hope never did. But for 17 worlds, for 2 years, for borrowed time, purchased through impossible force, applied against impossible odds, it was enough. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war enough, was the closest thing to victory that anyone ever achieved. The file closed. The war continued. And Superboy Prime, who had wanted to be a hero, settled for being the reason 400 million people survived to see tomorrow. It was not the story he had wanted to write. But it was the story that existed. And in Imperium Nihilus, that distinction was the only one that mattered. Prime's impact rippled across Imperium Nihilus in ways the Inquisition could not fully contain. The Great Rift's instability persisted. Demon incursions dropped by 40% as manifestation routes collapsed unpredictably. Navigation through the cicatrix became marginally safer, restoring trade corridors lost for decades. Cluster Primus became legend. 17 worlds where justice functioned without corruption, where faith produced results instead of demands. Other sectors whispered about the king in shadow who had rejected imperial doctrine and survived. Some called it hope. The Inquisition called it contagion. Dante learned that impossible problems sometimes required impossible solutions, even when those solutions refused to fit doctrine. The Mechanicus cataloged Prime as unsolved anomaly data that rewrote physics without explanation. And in the dark places between stars, chaos entities adjusted their strategies, forced to account for variables that should not exist. Prime had not saved the galaxy, had not closed the rift, had not fixed the Imperium's fundamental rot. But he had proven that reality was negotiable if one possessed sufficient force and absolute refusal to accept impossibility. In the grim darkness of the far future, that lesson was heresy. It was also the only reason 17 worlds still drew breath.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.